There is a wooden box that Jesse Pinkman built in a high school shop class, and years later, sitting in a circle of recovering addicts in a fluorescent-lit room, he describes it in a level of detail that stops you cold. Peruvian walnut, he says, with zebra wood inlaid all the way around, the joints held with tiny pegs instead of screws, the whole thing sanded so many times it felt like glass, then finished by hand with oil. It was the best work he had ever done. And then, almost as an afterthought, he tells the group what he did with it. He traded it for weed. That box is the whole man in a single object, the talent, and the tenderness, and the quiet certainty that he does not deserve anything good, and almost nobody talks about how much of Jesse is hidden in that one story. Tonight we are going through all of it, the whole psychology of Jesse Pinkman, slowly and from the beginning. So get comfortable, turn the lights down low, we will be here a while, and if you haven't subscribed to Rock yet, it genuinely helps us keep making these. Before Jesse ever cooks a gram of anything, before Walter White, before the desert, there is a note. It sits in an old chemistry notebook, and the words are written in red ink in the neat, disappointed hand of a teacher. Apply yourself. 2 words. And the thing about those 2 words is that they are not really instruction, they are a verdict. They tell a teenager that the failure is not in the work but in the person, that whatever went wrong is a moral shortfall, a matter of will, a laziness at the center of who you are. Jesse kept that notebook, he kept it for years. When you meet him, he is a small-time methamphetamine cook and dealer in Albuquerque, going by the street name Cap'n Cook, all baggy clothes and backwards caps, and a vocabulary that seems designed to make sure no one takes him seriously, and it would be very easy to read him the way the world around him reads him, as a screw-up, a burnout, a punchline. But the notebook tells you something the surface hides. Somebody once expected more of him, and he agreed with them about the falling short. He did not come from nothing. This is one of the quiet cruelties of Jesse's story, and it matters for everything that follows. He was raised in a comfortable middle-class family in Albuquerque, the kind of household with a nice lawn and a second car and expectations. His mother is Diane. He has a younger brother named Jake, and Jake is the good son, the gifted one, the child who plays instruments and gets the grades, and gets held up, gently and constantly, as the standard Jesse keeps missing. There is a scene the show gives you where the parents fuss over Jake while Jesse stands slightly outside the frame of their attention, and it tells you almost everything about the emotional weather he grew up in. He was not neglected in the way a child in poverty is neglected. He was neglected in a subtler, more middle-class way, the way a kid can be present at every dinner and still feel like the family's ongoing problem, the disappointment they have learned to manage, rather than the child they are proud of. What the research on this kind of upbringing tends to describe, and what the series dramatizes without ever using the vocabulary, is a boy who internalized a story about himself very early. Not, I did a bad thing, I am a bad thing. And once that story is installed, it becomes a lens. Every stumble confirms it. Every success feels like a fluke that will soon be corrected. His parents did not throw him out into the cold. In a way, what they did was worse, which was to keep offering him love on conditions he could never quite meet, and then to withdraw it in ways that always seemed to be about tough love and never about the fact that they had run out of patience for him. There is the house, for instance. Jesse spends part of the series living in a home that belonged to his Aunt Ginny, his mother's sister, who died of cancer. And there is a detail here that gets under my skin, because it complicates the burnout reading completely. Jesse cared for her while she was dying. He was there. The kid the family had written off as the irresponsible one was the one who sat with the dying woman, and when she was gone he stayed in her house, and for a while it was the one place in the world that felt like his. His parents own that house now, and across the run of the show they maneuver to get him out of it, eventually leveraging the discovery of a drug lab in the basement to force a sale and push him out on terms that let them keep their hands clean. They get their money, they keep their reputation, and their son is once again the family embarrassment they have quietly solved. What I want you to hold on to, as we move through everything that happens to this man, is that the wound is there before the crime. The self-hatred predates Walter White. Jesse arrives on screen already believing that he is the kind of person things like this happen to, already fluent in the idea that he is a disappointment wearing a person's clothes, and that belief is the soft place where every future manipulation will land. You cannot understand why Jesse stays where he stays, and loves who he loves, and punishes himself the way he punishes himself, unless you understand that he was handed a story about his own worthlessness before he was old enough to argue with it. Everything after this is that story being tested, again and again, by a world that seems almost designed to prove it right. The first time we really see him, he is climbing out of a window, half-dressed, dropping off a roof as a DEA raid hits the house next door, and there is something almost comic about it. This scrambling small-time crook in his underwear escaping across the lawns of a nice neighborhood. That comedy is not an accident. Jesse is introduced as a joke, and he spends a great deal of the early show performing the joke, because the performance is a kind of armor. Consider the way he talks. The constant profanity, the word bitch attached to the end of half his sentences, the yeah, science, the swagger, the way he narrates his own life as if it were a music video he is starring in. It is very funny, and it is meant to be, but if you watch it as psychology rather than as comic relief, you start to see what it is doing. It is a wall. A person who is certain, deep down, that he is stupid and worthless, will often build an entire personality out of not caring, because not caring is safer than trying, and being confirmed as a failure. If you never admit you want the good grade, no one can tell you that you didn't earn it. If you turn yourself into Cap'n Cook, a swaggering street persona with a brand name, then you get to be somebody on purpose, instead of a nobody by accident. And then the one man in the world most qualified to see through that wall walks back into his life. Walter White was Jesse's high school chemistry teacher, the man who wrote Apply Yourself in that notebook, and now Walt is a terminally ill man who has decided to cook methamphetamine to leave his family money, and he needs a partner who already knows the trade. He tracks Jesse down, he recognizes him fleeing that raid, and the very first note of their relationship is blackmail, Walt leaning on Jesse with the threat of exposure, and that is worth sitting with, because it means the founding transaction between them is coercion, dressed up as opportunity. From the first minute, Walt has power over Jesse, and Jesse is once again in the presence of the authority figure who graded him and found him wanting. The dynamic is set before either of them cooks anything. The teacher who told him he wasn't good enough is now his boss, and the failing student is going to spend the next 2 years trying, without ever quite realizing he is doing it, to finally earn the grade. Here is the part I find truly painful about the early episodes, the part that reframes all the comedy. Jesse is good at this. Not brilliant the way Walt is brilliant, not a chemist who can lecture on reaction pathways, but competent, resourceful, streetwise in ways Walt is helpless without. He knows the distribution side. He knows how to move product, how to talk to the people you have to talk to, how to survive in a world Walt finds bewildering and terrifying. In their partnership, Jesse is not the dead weight, whatever Walt's contempt keeps implying. He is half the operation. But he has spent his whole life being told he is the screw-up, and so when Walt treats him as the screw-up, it does not feel like an insult. It feels like the truth. It feels like home. That is the trap closing, and it closes so gently that you can watch it happen and mistake it for a working relationship. You can already see, in these first cooks in a rusted recreational vehicle out in the desert, the shape of the man Jesse could have been if the story about himself had been different. He wants Walt's approval so badly that he lights up whenever he gets a scrap of it. When Walt praises the product, when Walt lets him in on a plan, when Walt for a moment treats him like a peer instead of an errand boy, Jesse glows, and then a beat later Walt says something cutting and the glow dies, and Jesse retreats back behind the swagger. The show is showing you the emotional metabolism of a person who runs on external validation because he was never given the internal kind. He has no stable sense that he is okay. He has to be told, over and over, by someone whose opinion he has decided matters, and he has chosen the worst possible someone. He has chosen a man who will learn, faster than anyone, exactly how to use that need against him. There is a temptation, watching Breaking Bad casually, to treat Jesse as the comic sidekick who occasionally has feelings, the guy who says the funny lines and gets into trouble and needs to be bailed out. I understand the temptation because the surface really is funny, but the whole engine of the show depends on you eventually seeing past it, and the sooner you do, the sadder the early seasons become. Science is a kid who was told he was too dumb for science, performing enthusiasm as a defense. Every bitch is a person keeping you at a distance so you cannot get close enough to confirm what he already believes. The bravado is not who Jesse is. It is the bandage over who Jesse is. And across 5 seasons, Breaking Bad is going to peel it off one layer at a time, until there is nothing left but the wound underneath. And by then, you will have long since stopped laughing. To understand the single most important relationship in Jesse's life, the one that shapes and warps him more than any drug, you have to understand a specific and well-documented pattern and it goes by the name of intermittent reinforcement. Psychologists studying attachment and abusive relationships have described it for decades, and it is one of the strongest behavioral forces we know of. The idea is simple and terrible. If you reward someone every single time they do a thing, the behavior is steady but shallow, and if you punish them every time, they leave. But if you reward them unpredictably, warmth then coldness, praise then contempt, kindness then cruelty, with no way to know which is coming, you create something close to addiction. The person cannot leave, because they are always waiting for the next hit of warmth, always convinced that if they just get it right this time, the good version of you will come back and stay. Slot machines are built on this principle. So it turns out, are the worst relationships, and so is the bond between Jesse Pinkman and Walter White. Watch how Walt operates over the seasons, and you see the machine running. He calls Jesse an idiot, a junkie, a screw-up, worthless, and then, at the exact moment Jesse is most crushed, most ready to walk away, Walt turns and tells him he is talented, that the cook they did together was the best he had ever seen, that he needs him, that nobody else could have done it. He drives Jesse away and then comes back for him. He endangers Jesse's life and then saves it. He lies to Jesse constantly and then delivers a single true-sounding moment of tenderness that erases, in Jesse's starved heart, all the lies that came before. And because Jesse grew up hungry for exactly this, for the approval of a father figure who withholds it, the pattern does not read to him as abuse. It reads as love that he has to keep earning. That is the horror of it. The very thing being done to him is the thing he has been trained his whole life to interpret as care. Layered on top of the reinforcement pattern is the surrogate-father dynamic, and it runs both ways, which is what makes it so hard for either of them to escape. Walt has a son he loves and cannot control, a bright boy with cerebral palsy who idolizes him, and Jesse becomes a second son, one Walt can shape and command and punish and, crucially, one who needs him. And Jesse, who has a father that regards him as a failure and a problem to be managed, finds in Walt an older man who is brilliant, who takes him seriously enough to yell at him, who occasionally, dazzlingly, seems proud of him. Each of them is filling a hole in the other with exactly the wrong material. Walt gets a son who will do the terrible things his real son must never know about. Jesse gets a father who will use the very depth of his longing as a handle to steer him by. The show is not subtle about the father language either, especially near the end, and when it finally names the thing out loud, it lands like a gut punch, precisely because you have watched it grow for years. What makes Jesse's loyalty a tragedy rather than a weakness is that it is not stupidity. This is the part I really want to be clear about, because it would be easy to watch Jesse keep going back to Walt and think, why doesn't he just leave? What is wrong with him? But a trauma bond is not a failure of intelligence. It is a survival strategy that made sense in the environment where it was learned. When you are a child dependent on caregivers who are unpredictable, attaching harder, reading their moods, working to earn the good version of them, that is adaptive. It keeps you fed. It keeps you safe. The problem is that the strategy outlives the childhood, and the adult keeps applying it to people who do not deserve it, keeps mistaking the anxiety of intermittent reward for the feeling of love, keeps believing that if they are just good enough, loyal enough, useful enough, the cruelty will finally stop. Jesse is not weak. He is running a program that was installed to protect him, and now delivers him, over and over, into the hands of the one man most willing to exploit it. And there is a component of the bond that is easy to overlook, which is indebtedness. Walt saves Jesse's life more than once, and Jesse knows it. Walt pulls him out of situations that would have killed him. That is real, and it complicates everything, because gratitude is a genuine feeling, and Jesse is a deeply grateful person, and so the ledger between them is never clean. Every time Jesse decides he is finished with Walt, some memory surfaces of the time Walt came for him, and the guilt of leaving a man who saved your life gets tangled up with the fear and the longing and the addiction, and the knot pulls tighter. Abusers often do this without even planning it, mixing real rescues in with the harm so that the victim can never quite draw the line, can never say cleanly, this person is bad for me, because part of them is telling the truth when they say, but he saved my life. Jesse spends years unable to make that cut, and when he finally does, when he finally sees Walt whole and clear, it is one of the great turning points of psychological growth in the entire series, and it costs him almost everything he has left. The violence starts almost immediately, and the way Jesse responds to it is the first real evidence that he does not belong in the life he has chosen. Early in the partnership there are two men, Emilio and a dealer known as Krazy-Eight, and a confrontation that ends with the two of them needing to be disposed of. Walt handles the killing itself in the end, but the aftermath falls to Jesse, and Walt gives him a specific instruction: to dissolve a body using a strong acid, and to do it in a plastic container because the acid will eat through anything that is not plastic. Jesse does not use the plastic container. He carries the remains up to the bathroom of the house he is living in and uses his own bathtub, and the acid does exactly what Walt warned it would do. It eats through the tub and through the floor and comes down through the ceiling below in a way that is truly horrifying and that I will not describe further, because the point of the scene is not the gore, the point is the mistake. Jesse could not follow the instruction. Some part of him could not treat this as a chemistry problem to be solved cleanly, could not go fully cold, and the failure to be a good criminal is, if you look at it the right way, the first flicker of the thing that will eventually be his salvation and his torment in equal measure. He has a conscience, and a conscience is a liability in the meth trade. Watch Jesse in the wake of those early deaths, and you see a young man coming apart in a way Walt simply does not. Walt compartmentalizes. Walt tells himself stories about family and necessity, and finds a way to keep his hands steady. Jesse cannot do that. The killing sits in him. It disturbs his sleep, it shows up in his flinching and his jumpiness, it drives him toward the drugs that quiet the noise. This is one of the clearest early contrasts the show draws between the two of them, and it is a contrast of moral wiring. Walt is a man who can do monstrous things and remain on the surface composed, which turns out to be the truly monstrous trait. Jesse is a man who does far fewer terrible things and is visibly destroyed by each one, which turns out to be evidence of a soul that never fully hardened. In almost any other genre you would call Walt the strong one and Jesse the weak one. Breaking Bad slowly, patiently inverts that, until you understand that Jesse's inability to cope is not weakness at all. It is the last honest thing in the series. It is a nervous system still telling the truth about what these acts cost. There is a concept in the trauma literature called moral injury, and it is worth naming here because it maps onto Jesse almost perfectly, and it is distinct from ordinary trauma. Ordinary trauma is what happens to you, the terror of being hurt or nearly killed. Moral injury is different. Moral injury is the wound you take from doing, or failing to prevent, something that violates your own deepest sense of right and wrong. Soldiers get it. First responders get it. It produces a specific kind of anguish, shame, and guilt, and a sense that you have become unforgivable, that you have damaged your own soul in a way no one can repair. And the reason Jesse suffers so much more visibly than the other criminals around him is that he keeps taking moral injuries that they are immune to, because he still has the moral sense to be injured. The others have either never had it or have long since amputated it. Jesse carries his into a world that punishes it relentlessly, and every death he causes or witnesses lands on that intact conscience and does damage that accumulates and never drains away. What makes this so much heavier is that Jesse blames himself for a great deal that is not his fault, which is the signature of guilt that has metastasized past reason. A healthy conscience assigns responsibility roughly where it belongs. Jesse's conscience assigns responsibility to Jesse. When people die near him, when children are harmed anywhere in his vicinity, some machinery inside him reaches out and takes the weight, whether or not he did the thing, because at the deepest level he already believes he is the bad thing, the source of the harm, the person around whom terrible events organize themselves. This is where the childhood story and the adult trauma fuse into one continuous wound. The kid who was told he was the family's problem grows into a man who experiences every catastrophe as further proof, and the drug world keeps supplying catastrophes, and so the belief keeps getting fed. He does not need much evidence to convict himself. He has been building the case since he was a boy. And here is the cruel irony that the acid and the bathtub set up right at the start. The very qualities that make Jesse a bad criminal, the conscience, the empathy, the inability to go cold, the way harm sticks to him, are the qualities that make him a good person, and the world he has entered has no use for good people except as tools. Every soft thing about him becomes a lever someone can pull. His guilt can be aimed, his love can be weaponized, his need to protect can be turned into a leash. Over and over across the series, the people who want to control Jesse do it not by attacking his flaws, but by exploiting his virtues, and that is a starkly dark observation about how the world uses the tender-hearted. It is not his failings that get him hurt. It is his goodness, dropped into a machine that only knows how to grind goodness into fuel. If the early deaths injure Jesse's conscience, the arrival of Tuco Salamanca injures something more primal, which is his basic sense of physical safety in the world. Tuco is a distributor, a violent and erratically dangerous man whose moods can turn from laughter to murder in a single breath, and Jesse's introduction to him is a beating. He goes to sell product and is savagely assaulted, and later he and Walt both end up kidnapped and held by Tuco out in the desert, at the mercy of a person who might kill them for a joke, or a slight, or no reason at all. They survive, barely, and Tuco is eventually killed in a shootout with Hank, Walt's brother-in-law and a DEA agent. But the psychological residue of that stretch does not leave Jesse when Tuco does. Something has been rewired. He has learned, in his nerves rather than his thoughts, that the world he is in can grab him at any moment and hurt him without warning, and a nervous system that has learned that lesson does not simply unlearn it, because the immediate threat is gone. This is where you start to see, if you are watching for it, the classic architecture of trauma taking shape in Jesse. Hypervigilance, the constant low-grade scanning for danger that never fully switches off. The exaggerated startle, the way he jumps at sudden noises and movements. The sleep that will not come, or comes broken. The flashes of rage that seem out of proportion until you understand that a body braced for threat pours out fight chemistry at small provocations because it is always half ready for the big one. And underneath all of it, the slow erosion of the sense that anywhere is safe, which is maybe the cruelest loss of all. Because a person who cannot feel safe anywhere cannot rest, and a person who cannot rest cannot heal, and so the trauma feeds on the exhaustion it creates. Jesse is not a diagnosis, he is a fictional character, and I want to be careful not to reduce him to a checklist. But the writing renders these responses so precisely, across so many episodes, that they read like something drawn from life, and the writers have talked about wanting Jesse's damage to feel real, rather than decorative. What Tuco represents, in the larger shape of Jesse's psychology, is the introduction of raw fear as a permanent tenet. Before Tuco, the drug world was dangerous, in an abstract, exciting way, the way it looks to a young man who has watched too many movies and cast himself as the hero. After Tuco, it is dangerous in a way his body understands, and that understanding never fully recedes. You can trace a line from that desert to every later moment where Jesse freezes or flinches or breaks, because each new terror lands on ground that Tuco already softened. Trauma is cumulative like that. It is not that each event exists in isolation and is dealt with and filed away. It is that each event lands on the scar tissue of the last, and the scar tissue is thinner and more tender than fresh skin, and so the same blow that a person might have survived intact early on can shatter them later, once enough damage has stacked up beneath it. And notice what Jesse does with the fear, because it tells you about his coping repertoire, which is thin. He does not have the tools to process what is happening to him. He was never taught them, and the world he lives in offers none. So he reaches for the only reliable off switch he knows, which is chemical. The drugs quiet the hypervigilance, blur the flashbacks, soften the startle, buy him a few hours where the body stops screaming. This is the thing people who have never been close to addiction find hardest to understand, that for a traumatized person the drug is not primarily about pleasure, it is about relief, about turning down a volume that has become unbearable. Jesse's use tracks his terror. When the fear spikes, the use spikes. He is not chasing a high so much as fleeing a low, and every time he flees into the chemical, the underlying wound goes another round without treatment, and gets a little worse, and demands a little more next time. It is one of the cruelest loops a person can be caught in, and Jesse is caught in it early, and he does not get out for a very long time. There is an episode in the second season called Peekaboo, and if you want to find the exact location of Jesse's soul, the intact center that all the damage is orbiting, this is where it lives. The setup is grim and ordinary. Two addicts have robbed Jesse's friend Skinny Pete, and Jesse is sent to their house to get the money or the drugs back, and he goes reluctantly, trying to play the tough enforcer he is not, and what he finds inside is a filthy, half-collapsing house, and, in the middle of it, a small child. A little boy, maybe 5 years old, dirty and hungry and neglected, left alone in the wreckage of his parents' addiction. And everything about Jesse's mission evaporates in the face of that kid. He cannot leave him. He feeds him. He gets him cleaned up. He puts on a puppet show with his own hands to make the boy laugh. He sits with him and watches over him, this small-time criminal who came to collect a debt, transformed instantly and completely into a caretaker, because in the presence of a neglected child, something in Jesse recognizes something in the child, and cannot look away. I think this is the most important thing to understand about Jesse's psychology. more important than the addiction or the trauma or even the bond with Walt, and it is this. His tenderness toward children is where his true self is stored, sealed off and preserved from everything the drug world does to the rest of him. It is not a coincidence that a man who believes he is worthless, who cannot accept a single good thing about himself, comes alive and becomes gentle and capable and good the instant a child needs him. Children are the one category of person Jesse's self-hatred has no argument against. He can convince himself he deserves every bad thing that happens to him, but he cannot convince himself that a child deserves to suffer, and so with children the poison in his head goes quiet, and what is left is the person he might have been. In the wreck of that house, tending a stranger's kid, Jesse is briefly whole. And the tragedy the show is setting up, though you do not feel it yet, is that this exact tenderness is the thing the world will keep reaching for when it wants to hurt him most. There is a psychological reading of this that goes deeper than simple kindness, and it has to do with the neglected child Jesse himself was. When you meet a person who is drawn, powerfully and almost compulsively, to protect neglected children, you are often looking at someone who was a neglected child, protecting the kid they once were by proxy. Jesse cannot go back and rescue the boy who stood outside his parents' attention, the boy who was treated as the family's ongoing disappointment, the boy who decided somewhere in there that he was bad. But he can rescue this boy, and this one, and the next one, and each rescue is a small argument against the story of his own worthlessness, a way of saying, at least in this I am not the bad thing, at least here I am the one who helps. Displaced parenthood, you might call it, the redirection of a longing to be cared for into the act of caring for others, and it is one of the more beautiful and more heartbreaking things a wounded person can do. Beautiful because it is real love, and heartbreaking because it is love that could not find its way home and had to be given away to strangers instead. The way Peekaboo ends tells you how the world treats this part of Jesse. The situation collapses into violence between the two addict parents, ugly and sudden, and when it is over, Jesse does the one thing his conscience demands. He gets the boy out, he makes sure the child is safe and away from the horror, and he calls for help, and he leaves the kid where he will be found and looked after. He does not profit. He does not win. He walks away having gained nothing except the knowledge that he protected one small person from one small piece of the darkness, and for Jesse that is enough, because that is the currency his soul actually runs on, not money, not respect, not the swagger of Cap and Cook, but the sense, however fleeting, that he kept something innocent from being destroyed. Hold on to this, because the show is going to come back to it again and again, and every time it does, it is going to be worse. And the reason it is going to be worse is precisely that you now know how much this means to him. And there is a quieter observation buried in the episode that I have never quite gotten over. Jesse is good at this. He is a natural with the boy, patient and warm and inventive. The puppet show, the gentleness, the instinct for what a frightened child needs. In another life, the one where the note in the notebook said something kinder, Jesse Pinkman might have been somebody's wonderful father, somebody's beloved teacher, the adult a struggling kid remembers decades later as the one who saw them. The capacity is right there, fully formed, visible in every frame of that episode. It is just attached to a man who has been convinced he deserves none of it, dropped into a life that will never let him use it, and that gap, between the father he could have been and the wreckage he is trapped inside, is one of the saddest things Breaking Bad ever shows you, precisely because it shows it to you so lightly, in the middle of an episode about a drug debt. For all that Jesse is defined by his relationship with Walt, he has another set of relationships that reveal an entirely different side of him, and those are his friendships. Skinny Pete, Badger, Combo, the crew of low-level dealers and hangers-on who orbit him. These are not sophisticated men. They are, by most measures, losers, small-time operators who are not going anywhere, and the show could easily have played them purely for comedy, and often it does let them be funny. But watch how Jesse is with them, because it is the mirror image of how Walt is with Jesse. He is loyal to them, he looks out for them, he gives them work when they need it, and shares what he has, and treats them, fundamentally, as friends rather than as tools, and when one of them is in trouble he does not calculate whether helping serves his interests, he just helps. Jesse gives freely the exact thing that is always rationed out to him, which is unconditional regard, and the fact that he can give it, having so rarely received it, tells you the capacity for it was always in him, waiting. Then Combo dies, and it is the first time the war Jesse is part of takes someone he actually loves. Combo is shot and killed while working a corner, selling on territory that has drawn the wrong kind of attention, and the person who pulls the trigger is a child, a young boy sent to do a grown man's killing, which is its own horror that the series lets land without underlining. And for Jesse, Combo's death is not an abstraction, not a cost of doing business, not a line in a ledger. It is a friend, gone. On a corner Jesse had a hand in putting him on. The guilt attaches instantly, and it does not let go. Survivor's guilt, the anguish of the one who lived over the one who died, the endless private accounting of what I could have done differently, and layered under it the specific self-accusation that fits Jesse's whole psychology like a key in a lock, that it should have been me, that Combo was better than me, that the wrong person died. He does not say all of this out loud. He does not have to. You can see it settle into him, one more weight on a frame already carrying too much. What Combo's death does to Jesse in practical terms is push him deeper into the drugs, and this is where you start to see the addiction stop being a habit and start being a way of life, a full retreat. He spirals. The parties get emptier and more desperate, the use heavier, the days more shapeless, and the whole time you understand that he is not partying in any celebratory sense. He is anesthetizing, trying to keep the grief and the guilt and the fear submerged under enough chemistry that they cannot surface and drown him. And this is the pattern that will define the middle stretch of his story, the way loss drives use and use compounds loss, because the more he numbs, the less he functions, and the less he functions, the more disasters accumulate, and every disaster is another reason to numb. He is trying to build a wall against the pain, and the bricks he is using are the same substance that keeps knocking the wall down. There is something worth pausing on in how differently Jesse and Walt experience the deaths that pile up around their enterprise, because Combo throws it into sharp relief. To Walt, the people who die are increasingly problems that got solved, obstacles removed, and he develops an extraordinary capacity to fold each death into a story where he is not really responsible, where circumstances or other people, or Jesse himself, bear the weight. To Jesse, every death is a person, and the person does not stop being a person just because they are dead, and the responsibility does not distribute itself conveniently, it simply lands on him. This is not because Jesse is more involved in the deaths, he is usually less involved than Walt. It is because Jesse has kept the thing that lets a death register as a death, and Walt has traded it away by degrees for the sake of staying functional and staying free. The show is quietly building its central moral argument through exactly this contrast, that the ability to remain calm in the presence of your own harm is not strength, it is a kind of death of its own, and that Jesse's inability to stay calm, his tendency to fall apart, is the sign that he is still, underneath everything, alive in the way that matters. And then there is Jane, and to talk about Jane is to talk about the first time Jesse is genuinely, mutually loved by an adult who chooses him, and about the way that love is taken from him, and about the fact that the man who took it away was standing 3 feet from him and did nothing. Jane Margolis is his landlord, the young woman who owns the duplex where he rents, and she is an artist, sharp and a little guarded, and she is also a recovering addict in the fragile early work of staying clean, with a father, Donald, who loves her fiercely and is terrified of losing her again. Jesse and Jane fall for each other slowly and then completely, and for a stretch of the second season you get to see a version of Jesse you almost never see, a man who is soft and open and hopeful, who talks about the future, who wants to be better because someone has given him a reason. Jane sees him. Not Captain Cook, not the screw-up, not Walt's errand boy, but Jesse, and being seen like that is oxygen to a person who has spent his life feeling invisible, or worse, seen and found wanting. The tragedy built into the relationship is that they are two addicts in love, and each one is the other's greatest danger and greatest comfort at the same time. Jane is in recovery, Jesse is using, and love, which should be the thing that saves them, becomes instead the thing that pulls Jane back under, because it is very hard to stay clean beside someone you love who is using, and eventually she relapses, and now they are using together, and the drug they fall into together is heroin, which is a different order of danger than the world Jesse has known. Watching them get high together is not fun, it is not glamorous, it is two wounded people who have found in each other both a reason to live and a shared permission to slowly die, and the show holds that contradiction without flinching. They talk about getting clean together, about running away, about a future, and they mean it, and they are also sinking, and both things are true at once, which is exactly how addiction actually works, the sincere plan to stop coexisting with the next use. the hope and the self-destruction sharing the same bed. The night it ends is one of the quietly devastating things Breaking Bad ever filmed, and I want to be careful to describe it exactly as it happens, because the precision is the whole point. Walt comes to the apartment to find Jesse, over a business matter, and finds the two of them unconscious, passed out together after using. And as Walt is there, trying to rouse Jesse, he jostles the bed, and Jane, lying on her back, begins to choke, her body doing the terrible thing that a body does when it is overdosed and cannot protect its own airway. And Walt, who could turn her, who could save her with the smallest motion, hesitates. He reaches out, and then he stops, and he stands there and he lets it happen, and he watches Jane Margolis die a few feet from the man who loves her, while that man sleeps beside her, unaware. She dies of the overdose. Walt does not touch her. He simply chooses not to save her, and then he leaves, and he lets Jesse wake up to discover her gone, and he says nothing about what he saw, and he carries that secret for years like a blade he is keeping in reserve. The reasons Walt lets her die are tangled and ugly. Jane had leverage over him. She had threatened to expose the operation to get money that was owed to Jesse, and a Jane who lived was a Jane who could pull Jesse away from Walt and out of the business, taking Walt's partner and Walt's product with her. So her death served Walt in several ways at once, and whether he consciously calculated all of that in the moment, or simply let a convenient death occur, the effect is the same, and it is monstrous. But here is what matters for Jesse's psychology, and it is almost unbearable. Jesse does not know. He wakes to find Jane dead beside him, and the story he tells himself, the story everyone lets him tell himself, is that he did this, that he was using with her, that if he had been stronger or more awake or better, she would be alive, that her death is one more entry in the long ledger of harm he causes just by existing. He takes the entire weight of it onto himself. The guilt goes exactly where his psychology always sends guilt, straight to his own account, and the one man who could lift even a portion of it, who knows Jesse could not have done anything because Jesse was unconscious, chooses silence, because Walt needs Jesse's guilt more than he needs Jesse's peace. After Jane, Jesse comes apart completely. He is found in a crack house, a wreck, having tried to disappear into the drug entirely, to follow her down as far as the chemistry will take him without quite dying, and it is Walt, in one of those intermittent flashes of care that keep the whole bond alive, who pulls him out and gets him into a rehabilitation program. And you can see the machine running again even here, because to Jesse this looks like Walt saving him, Walt the rescuer, Walt the father who comes when it is worst, and the gratitude for the rescue gets layered on top of a grief that Walt himself engineered. That is the depth of the entanglement by this point. The man comforting Jesse over Jane's death is the man who let Jane die. Jesse leans into the arms of the person who took everything from him, and thanks him for being there, and none of it is Jesse's fault, because he cannot see what we saw, and the dramatic irony of it is so heavy it is almost hard to keep watching. When the truth of that night finally reaches Jesse, seasons later, it will not just be a revelation, it will be the detonation of everything, and we will get there, but for now hold the image of a grieving man being consoled by his beloved's killer, and understand that this is the exact center of what Walter White does to Jesse Pinkman. Rehab gives Jesse the closest thing the series ever offers him to a genuine chance at a self, and it comes in the form of a counselor and a group, and a single idea he cannot accept, and the idea is self-acceptance. The program teaches that recovery begins with accepting yourself, that you cannot climb out of the pit until you stop hating the person doing the climbing, and for most of the people in the room this is a lifeline. For Jesse, it is a wall he keeps walking into. And in one of the group sessions he tells a story that the series has been building toward from its very first frames, the story of the wooden box. And it is the moment his entire interior is laid bare in front of you. He describes a woodworking class in high school, a teacher named Mr. Pike, and a box he made, and the way he describes it is the tell, because he remembers everything. Peruvian walnut, zebra wood inlaid around the sides, joined with pegs, not screws, because screws would have been easier, and pegs were right. Sanded until it was smooth as glass, and finished by hand with oil. He made it, and remade it, chasing something, and it came out beautiful, and it was, he says, the best thing he ever did. The reason that story matters so much is that it is the proof, in Jesse's own words, that the talent and the patience and the care were always there, that given one teacher who did not write him off, and one task he was allowed to love, he made something truly fine. And then comes the ending of the story, the part that reveals the whole architecture of his self-destruction in a single sentence. The counselor, moved, asks whether he gave the box to his mother, and Jesse says no, he traded it. He gave the finest thing he ever made away for an ounce of weed, and he says it flatly, almost with a shrug, as if it is the natural and inevitable fate of anything good that passes through his hands. That is the psychology of Jesse Pinkman, compressed into one anecdote. He can create beauty. He cannot keep it. He cannot believe he deserves to keep it. The moment he makes something worthy, some deep certainty that he is not worthy reaches out and gets rid of it, trades it down, throws it away, because keeping it would mean believing he was the kind of person who gets to have good things, and that belief is the one thing his childhood took from him that he has never gotten back. What the counselor is selling, self-acceptance, is therefore precisely the medicine Jesse cannot swallow, and this is an acute piece of psychological writing, because for a certain kind of wounded person, self-acceptance does not feel like healing, it feels like a lie, or worse, like a cheat. To accept himself, in Jesse's logic, would be to let himself off the hook for the deaths and the damage, and he does not want off the hook. Some part of him needs the hook. The self-loathing is doing a job. It is a form of penance, an ongoing punishment he administers to himself, because being punished is at least a kind of moral order, at least an acknowledgement that what happened mattered and someone should suffer for it, and if the world will not make him suffer, then he will do it himself. This is why the program's message slides right off him. He is not looking for peace, he is looking for justice, and he has appointed himself the one who must pay. And no counselor telling him to be gentle with himself can compete with the deep, organizing conviction that he is guilty and deserves whatever comes. Around this same stretch, the world obliges his need for punishment in the bluntest way, when Hank Schrader, spiraling in his own hunt for the man behind the blue meth, tracks his frustration to Jesse's door and beats him savagely, a DEA agent putting his fists into a suspect until Jesse's face is a ruin. And there is something almost terrible in how little Jesse fights it, and how the beating fits, how it matches the internal weather, how a man who believes he deserves to be punished absorbs a punishment that has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with someone else's rage. Jesse uses the beating, in the end, as leverage, but I do not think you can watch that scene and see only a legal maneuver. You are watching a person receive the violence he has half decided he is owed, and the fact that he can turn it into a use, can extract something from his own brutalization, is not triumph. It is the reflex of someone who has learned that being hurt is simply the medium he moves through, and that the only question is whether he can get anything back for the pain. So Jesse comes out of rehab and back into the world with the wound named but not healed, having stood in a room full of people telling him he could accept himself, and having concluded, in the privacy of his own certainty, that they were wrong, that he was the exception, that the rules of mercy applied to everyone but him. This is the state he is in when the business pulls him back, and it is the state he will be in when it asks him to do the thing he has not yet done, the thing that will make all his prior guilt look almost innocent by comparison. Because up to this point, for all the death around him, Jesse has not himself killed an innocent person. That line is still uncrossed, and the machine he is caught in is about to walk him straight up to it and put the weight of crossing it on him alone. Gale Boetticher is, in a sense, the most innocent person in Breaking Bad, and that is exactly why the show chooses him. Gale is a gentle, nerdy chemist, a man who loves science and poetry and coffee brewed just so, who works for the drug kingpin Gustavo Fring not out of malice, but out of a slightly naive romance with the pure practice of chemistry, and he is warm to Jesse and to Walt, incapable of the coldness the world around him runs on. He is, in short, harmless, a person who has wandered into a lethal business without ever quite becoming lethal himself. And the reason his life comes to hang on Jesse Pinkman is pure, cold strategy. Gus has Walt and Jesse cooking his product, but Walt has become dangerous to Gus, too clever and too willful, and Gus's solution is to have Gale learn Walt's formula so that Walt can be discarded. And Walt understands, with the ruthless clarity he brings to his own survival, that the moment Gale can cook the blue meth alone, both he and Jesse become disposable. So Walt makes a calculation, and the calculation requires Gale to die before he can be trained, and Walt cannot do it himself because he is being watched, and so it falls, as everything falls, to Jesse. The scene where Jesse goes to Gale's apartment is one of the hardest in the entire series to sit through, and it earns its difficulty. Jesse is not a killer. Everything we have watched for 2 seasons has established that he is the opposite of a killer, that death undoes him, that his whole psychology is organized around a conscience that cannot bear harm. And now, to save his own life and Walt's, he stands at the door of a gentle man who has done nothing to him, a man who opens the door in confusion, and Jesse raises a gun, and he is weeping, his hands shaking, apologizing even as he does it, and Gale, understanding, pleads, and Jesse pulls the trigger. The show, mercifully, cuts on the gunshot, denying us the image and leaving us only the sound and the knowledge, but the mercy is entirely for us, because for Jesse there is no cut, there is only the before and the after, and he will live in the after for the rest of his life. He has now done the one thing he could not undo. He has killed an innocent person with his own hand, face to face, and no story he tells himself can turn Gale into anything other than what he was, which was harmless. The psychological difference between this and every death that came before is total, and it is worth being precise about why. Combo, Jane, the men in the desert, all of those deaths injured Jesse's conscience, but he could locate them, however unfairly, at some distance from his own hand. Gale is different. Gale is Jesse choosing, Jesse aiming, Jesse pulling the trigger on a person who is begging for his life. There is no ambiguity to hide in, no version of events where someone else did it, no possibility of telling himself he was merely nearby. He did this. And for a man whose entire self-concept is built on the belief that he is bad, the confirmation is catastrophic, because now the evidence is not circumstantial, now it is a body, and the deepest fear he has carried since childhood, that he destroys what he touches, that the ruin is coming from inside him, has been handed the most damning proof imaginable. Walt walked him to the edge of the one line he had never crossed and made him cross it, and the reason Walt could do that is the same reason Walt can do anything to Jesse. Jesse loves him, and needs him, and will do the unthinkable to keep them both alive, and Walt knows it, and uses it. Watch Jesse in the aftermath of Gale, and you are watching a soul with a hole blown through it. He goes quiet in a new way, a flat, hollowed-out way that is different from grief, because grief still believes in a world where things matter, and this is closer to the absence of belief altogether. He fills his house with people and noise and drugs, throws parties that go on for days, not because he wants to celebrate, but because he cannot bear to be alone in a silent room with what he has done, because in the silence Gale is there, at the door, opening it, and Jesse cannot hold that image and stay sane, so he drowns it in sound. This is dissociation and avoidance operating at full throttle, the mind doing everything it can to keep the unbearable memory from surfacing, and it works about as well as it ever works, which is to say not at all, because the memory does not go away when you refuse to look at it, it just waits, and it gets heavier, and it changes you from the inside while you are busy not looking. And here's the part that I find almost unbearably sad about the Gale killing, the thing that separates Jesse from nearly everyone else in his world. He does not get numb to it. Killing Gale does not turn Jesse into a killer, does not initiate him into some brotherhood of men who can do this and move on. It breaks him, and it keeps breaking him, and the breaking is, paradoxically, the last proof that he is not what the drug world wants to make him. A person who could kill Gale and be fine would be lost. Jesse killing Gale and being destroyed by it is a man whose conscience survived the very act meant to kill it, and that survival is the thin thread the entire back half of the series will hang on, because a man who can still be broken by what he has done is a man who can still, someday, want to be better, and everyone around Jesse, Walt most of all, will spend the coming seasons trying to sever that thread, and Jesse will spend those same seasons, without ever putting it in these words, fighting to keep it intact. The best single scene for understanding what Gale did to Jesse comes a little later, back in that same recovery group, and it is the one where he cannot say the word. Jesse returns to the meetings not because he wants to get clean, but because he is drowning and it is somewhere to sit, and when the group turns to him he tries to talk about what he has done, except he cannot say it, he cannot put the killing into plain language, and so he displaces it. He tells them about a dog. He says he put down a problem dog, a dog that had done nothing wrong, that never hurt anyone, and the group hears a story about euthanizing a difficult pet, and does not understand that they are hearing a confession to murder in the only code the confessor can bear to speak. It is a remarkable piece of writing, because it shows you exactly how guilt works in a mind that cannot hold it directly. The truth is too heavy to lift, so it gets wrapped in a metaphor light enough to carry into the room, and the metaphor is transparent to us and opaque to them, and Jesse gets to say the unsayable, while still, technically, not saying it at all. And then the counselor does the thing the program always does, the thing that helped so many of the others, and reaches for self-acceptance, gently steering Jesse toward the idea that he can forgive himself, that the point is not to judge but to accept. And Jesse detonates. He rejects it completely, and the way he rejects it is one of the truest things anyone says in the whole series about guilt. He asks, in effect, what the point of self-acceptance even is, whether it means you can do anything, hurt anyone, and just accept it, and he throws out an image that lands like a slap, the image of backing your truck over your own kid and then simply accepting it, as if acceptance were a machine for dissolving consequences. He is not arguing philosophy. He is defending the one thing he has left, which is his refusal to be at peace with what he did. Because to Jesse, being at peace with killing Gale would be the final corruption, the last piece of his soul handed over, and he would rather burn than let go of the guilt, because the guilt is the proof that Gale mattered, that a life was worth grieving, that Jesse is not yet the kind of man who can put a person down like a problem dog and move on. There is a cruelty in how the scene ends that tells you how far Jesse has turned his self-hatred outward by this point. When the counselor keeps pushing acceptance, Jesse lashes at the whole group, tells them they are nothing to him, that the only reason he comes is that they are customers, that he has been selling them the very drugs they are all fighting to escape. He says he made them his. He turns the room of vulnerable, recovering people into marks, and it is vicious, and it is meant to be, and the reason it is so painful is that it is also a kind of self-mutilation. Jesse is burning down the one place that ever offered him a way to be better, spitting on the outstretched hand, and he is doing it because he has decided he does not deserve the hand, because if he cannot be punished, then he will at least make sure he is not comforted, will make sure no one in that room mistakes him for someone worth saving. He attacks the group to protect his guilt. He would rather be hated than forgiven, because forgiveness would ask him to believe he is not the bad thing, and that is the one belief he cannot afford to give up, because it has been holding his whole identity together since he was a boy. What makes the problem dog scene the key to Jesse's guilt, as opposed to just an example of it, is that it shows the guilt is not a phase he is going through, but a structure he is built out of. This is complicated grief and moral injury, refusing every off-ramp on offer, and it is important to see that Jesse's refusal is not simple stubbornness or immaturity. There is a terrible integrity in it. In a show full of people finding ever more sophisticated ways to make peace with the harm they cause, Walt above all, with his endless self-justifying narratives, Jesse is the one who will not let himself off, who insists on carrying the full weight, who treats his own conscience as a debt that must never be forgiven, because forgiving it would insult the dead. It is an almost perfectly self-destructive way to be moral, and it is also, in a strange way, the truest, and the show knows this, and it never once lets you feel that Jesse is simply weak or broken here. He is the only one still keeping an accurate ledger, even if the ledger is killing him. And the drugs come roaring back, of course, because they always do, because a man carrying this much and refusing every method of setting it down has to do something with the pressure, and the something is chemical oblivion. The pattern I described in his earlier losses holds here with brutal consistency, the trauma spikes and the use spikes to match, and by now the use is less a series of choices than a permanent condition, a low continuous drone of numbing that keeps the worst of it at a survivable distance. He is not living so much as anesthetizing himself through the days, and the series lets that stretch of his life feel as gray and shapeless as it must feel from the inside, party after party, high after high, a man running from a room he carries with him everywhere, a room with a door in it, and a gentle chemist opening the door. It is easy to forget, in the shadow of Walt, that Jesse did once get a glimpse of what a good father figure looks like, and it came from an unlikely source, a taciturn older man named Mike Ehrmantraut who worked as a fixer and enforcer for the drug operation. Mike is a killer, let us be clear, a hard and pragmatic man who has done terrible things without apparent remorse, and yet the way he treats Jesse stands in almost total opposition to the way Walt treats him, and the contrast is one of the show's quietest and most important pieces of characterization. Mike, over time, comes to respect Jesse. He gives him real responsibility, brings him along on jobs, trusts him to handle himself, and crucially, he sees something in Jesse that Walt is always at pains to deny, which is competence and worth and a heart that has not gone rotten. Where Walt needs Jesse to be lesser, Mike lets him be more, and Jesse, starved for exactly this, rises to it. The psychology here is worth drawing out, because it clarifies something about what Jesse actually needed all along and never got. What Mike offers is not warmth, exactly. Mike is not a warm man, but something arguably more valuable to a person like Jesse, which is steady, non-contingent respect. Mike does not blow hot and cold. He does not praise Jesse one day and gut him the next. He is consistent, and his regard, once earned, does not get yanked away as a manipulation. And for Jesse, whose entire experience of authority has been the unpredictable withholding and granting of approval, Mike's steadiness is something close to healing. You can watch Jesse settle in his presence, become more capable, more grounded, less frantic, because for once he is dealing with an adult whose opinion of him is not a lever being worked. This is the great counterfactual the show dangles in front of you. Give Jesse one reliable, respecting older man, and he stabilizes. Give him Walt, and he disintegrates. The difference between the two men is the difference between a mentor and a predator, and Jesse's tragedy is that he got so much more of the predator than the mentor. The bitter joke of it is that Mike, of all people, is right about Walt, and says so, and Jesse cannot fully hear it, because the trauma bond is stronger than good advice. Mike sees Walt clearly, sees the ego and the danger and the poison, and he tries to keep Jesse at a distance from it, tries to pull him toward a cleaner exit, and there are moments when you can feel how badly Mike wants Jesse to get out. This hard old man carrying an unexpected tenderness for a screwed-up kid who reminds him, maybe, of something. But Walt's hold is too deep, and the pattern is too old, and every time Jesse drifts toward Mike's saner orbit, Walt reels him back with another flash of the intermittent warmth, another shared crisis, another appeal to the bond. Jesse cannot choose the good father over the bad one. Not yet. Because the bad one has his hooks in the oldest part of him, and the good one is offering something Jesse does not quite believe he is allowed to have. And then Mike is taken from him too, killed by Walt in a moment of wounded pride, and though Jesse does not witness it, and does not immediately know the full truth, the removal of Mike from his life closes off one of the only healthy channels he had. It is part of a larger and very deliberate pattern in Jesse's story, which is that every good influence, every person who truly wants the best for him and asks nothing corrupt in return, is systematically stripped away, while the corrupting influence endures. Jane, gone. The recovery group, burned. Mike, killed. Each removal leaves Jesse more isolated, and isolation is the essential precondition for the kind of control Walt and later others exert over him. Because a person with no one else to turn to has no leverage of their own, no exit, no alternative source of worth or safety. The isolation is not incidental to Jesse's suffering, it is the mechanism of it. Strip away everyone who might love him well, and what remains is a man who can only get his sense of self from the very people destroying him. If the killing of Gale is the cruelest thing Walt makes Jesse do, the poisoning of Brock is the cruelest thing Walt does to Jesse directly, and it works precisely because it aims at the tenderest, most protected part of him, his love for children. By the middle of the story, Jesse has found something like a family, a woman named Andrea Cantillo, whom he meets in recovery, and her young son Brock, a little boy Jesse comes to adore. And this matters enormously in the arithmetic of Jesse's soul, because after everything, after Gale and the parties and the numbness, here is a child who loves him, and a woman who wants him, and a chance, however fragile, at the one thing his whole psychology has been reaching for since the neglected boy in Peekaboo, which is a family he protects, and who lets him be good. Brock is Jesse's shot at redemption in the plainest human form. Not a grand act, not a sacrifice, just a kid who thinks Jesse is worth loving, and an ordinary life spent proving him right. So when Brock falls gravely ill, poisoned, and the doctors fear for his life, it strikes at the exact center of Jesse's reason to keep going, and the genius and horror of what Walt has engineered is that he has made Jesse believe the poison was meant for him and his cause. Walt, needing Jesse's help and loyalty to move against Gus Fring, manufactures a situation in which Jesse comes to believe that Gus had Brock poisoned with a specific toxin, the ricin that Jesse had been carrying, as a way of manipulating and punishing Jesse. In reality, Walt poisoned Brock himself, using berries from a lily-of-the-valley plant, not ricin at all, a poison chosen precisely because it would sicken the boy severely without necessarily killing him, and would point Jesse's rage in the direction Walt needed it pointed, at Gus, and away from Walt. It is among the coldest and most calculated acts of manipulation in the entire series, and its cost is a child's suffering, and its instrument is Jesse's love for that child. Consider what this requires of Walt as a person, because it clarifies the whole relationship. To do this, Walt has to look at the single most sacred thing in Jesse's life, the thing Jesse would die to protect, and use it as raw material. He has to be willing to poison a little boy, to risk that boy's life, and to inflict on Jesse the specific terror of watching a child he loves fight for survival, all in order to steer Jesse's loyalty back toward himself. There is no clearer illustration of the difference between them. Jesse's love for Brock is the last uncorrupted thing he has. Walt looks at that love and sees a tool, and the reason the manipulation works so completely is the same reason all of Walt's manipulations work, that he has studied Jesse for years, knows every soft place, knows that the fastest way to move Jesse is through a threatened child, and is willing to use that knowledge without limit. The very depth of Jesse's goodness, his capacity to love a boy who is not his own, becomes the handle by which he is steered toward Walt's ends. Brock survives, which matters, because it means this wound at least does not become another grave in Jesse's ledger, but the psychological damage of the episode compounds, in a delayed and terrible way, because for a long time Jesse does not know the truth. He believes what Walt wants him to believe. He acts on it, and that means Jesse is, once again, made an instrument of a scheme he does not understand, his love and his loyalty harvested by a man he trusts, and the discovery of the truth, when it finally comes, will not be a small correction. It will be the moment the entire structure of his devotion to Walt collapses at once, because you cannot learn that the man you loved as a father poisoned a child to control you and go on loving him. That knowledge is a solvent. It dissolves the bond. And when Jesse finally puts the pieces together, the recognition of what Walt is capable of, and always was capable of, is the beginning of the end of Jesse's blindness, and the beginning of the deadliest stretch of his life. There is a psychological point here about attachment and denial that is worth naming, because it explains why the truth about Brock takes so long to land. People in trauma bonds do not simply fail to see the abuse. They actively cannot afford to see it, because seeing it would mean facing that the person they have organized their whole world around is dangerous to them, and that recognition is so destabilizing that the mind resists it with everything it has. Jesse has staked his entire sense of safety and worth on Walt being, at bottom, someone who cares about him. To accept that Walt poisoned Brock is to lose that, to be truly alone, to have loved a monster, and the psyche will do almost anything to avoid that particular freefall. So Jesse holds the pieces in his hands for a long time without assembling them, not because he is stupid, but because assembling them costs more than he can bear to pay, until finally the evidence becomes undeniable and the wall comes down all at once, and what is on the other side of it is rage, and grief, and a terrible clarity. In the 5th and final season, there is an episode called Dead Freight, and it contains a heist that is thrilling right up until the instant it becomes something you wish you had never seen. Walt, Jesse, and their crew engineer an elaborate theft of a tanker car full of the chemical they need to cook, a train robbery pulled off with real cleverness, and for most of the episode it plays as a caper, tense and ingenious and even fun, the kind of sequence that makes you lean forward. And then, in the aftermath, as they are celebrating having gotten away clean, a boy appears. A young kid named Drew Sharp, out riding his dirt bike across the empty desert, who has stumbled onto the scene and seen them, and who waves, innocent, curious, a child on a bike in the middle of nowhere. And before anyone can fully register what is happening, Todd Alquist, the mild-mannered new member of the crew, draws a pistol and shoots the boy dead. Jesse screams for him to stop. It does no good. The child is gone, in an instant, murdered to protect the secret of the heist, and the caper curdles into one of the ugliest moments the show ever stages. For Jesse, the killing of Drew Sharp is a threshold, and it is important to understand why it hits him differently than even Gale did, because it is not about his own guilt this time, or not only. Jesse did not pull the trigger. Jesse begged Todd not to. But Jesse is part of the enterprise that killed the boy, and the boy is a child, and children are the one line Jesse's soul has never been able to abstract away, and so Drew Sharp's death lands on him as a kind of final verdict on the entire life he has been living. He looks at the body of that boy, and he sees, with total clarity, what the business is, what it does, what it turns people into, that a person like Todd can shoot a child on a bike and then wonder what everyone is so upset about. And something in Jesse breaks that does not unbreak. He cannot tell himself any more stories. He cannot party this one into silence. The murder of Drew Sharp is the moment Jesse stops being able to pretend that there is any version of this life that is not, at its root, the machine that just killed a kid for waving at the wrong people. The contrast between Jesse's reaction and Todd's is the whole moral architecture of the final season in miniature, and it is worth dwelling on because Todd is, in a sense, the anti-Jesse, the thing Jesse could have become if he had lost the war for his own soul. Todd is polite, eager, helpful, and completely empty where the conscience should be. He kills the boy without malice and without remorse, the way you might swat a fly, an obstacle removed, and afterward he is truly puzzled by everyone's distress, and that emptiness is far more frightening than any snarling villain, because it shows you what a human being looks like with the moral sense simply absent. And standing next to that emptiness is Jesse, wrecked, unable to eat or sleep, haunted, and the show is drawing the line as clearly as it can. This, the wreckage, is what a soul looks like. That, the polite blankness, is what its absence looks like. Everything the drug world has been trying to do to Jesse for years, grind down his conscience until he can kill a child and shrug, has produced its finished product in Todd, and Jesse looking at Todd is Jesse looking at the abyss the business wanted to turn him into, and refusing it. After Drew Sharp, Jesse wants out, completely and finally, and the way he tries to leave tells you everything about where his psychology has arrived. He does not negotiate for a bigger share. He does not try to set himself up. He wants to walk away from all of it, and specifically he wants to walk away from the money, the enormous pile of cash his years in the trade have earned him, because the money has stopped being money to him and become something closer to a physical manifestation of everything he has done to earn it. Every dollar is Gale, is Drew Sharp, is Jane, is the whole ledger, and Jesse cannot touch it without touching them. Walt, who understands people as instruments, cannot comprehend this, keeps trying to make Jesse take the money, cannot grasp that to Jesse the money is not a reward but a wound, that a man drowning in guilt does not want to be handed the physical proof of the blood he shed. And this refusal, this inability to hold on to the fortune his suffering bought, sets up one of the strangest images in the entire series, and it deserves its own moment, because it is the purest picture the show ever paints of what guilt actually does to a person who refuses to be forgiven. The image is this. Jesse, hollow-eyed and sleepless, gets into his car in the dead of night with millions of dollars in cash, and he drives slowly through the poor neighborhoods of Albuquerque, and out the window, handful by handful, he throws the money away. He flings it onto lawns and sidewalks and gutters, bundles of hundreds scattering in the dark, a fortune most people cannot imagine, gone, tossed out a car window by a man who looks less like he is giving a gift than like he is trying to get something off of himself. And that is exactly what it is. Jesse is not being generous. Generosity is warm, and this is not warm. This is a kind of exorcism, a man trying to physically rid himself of a substance that has become unbearable to hold, and the fact that the substance happens to be money only makes the scene stranger and truer. He cannot carry the guilt, and the money is the guilt made solid, and so he sheds it into the night, and even after it is gone he is not lighter, because the money was never really the weight. The weight was inside him, and you cannot throw that out a car window, though God knows he tries. What that scene understands about guilt is something most stories about wealthy criminals never touch, which is that for a person with an intact conscience, blood money is not an asset. It is a haunting. The ordinary fantasy of crime is that you do the terrible thing, and then you get to enjoy the rewards, that the money launders the deed, buys a life that makes the crime worth it. Jesse is the total refutation of that fantasy. To him, the money does not launder anything. It accuses, it is the receipt for every death, and the more of it he has, the more damned he feels, because the pile is a running total of the harm, and a man who wants above all to be punished cannot be soothed by a reward. So he tries to get rid of it, first by attempting to give it away to the families of the people the business destroyed, the parents of the murdered boy, the granddaughter of Mike, and when that legitimate channel is blocked, he simply starts throwing it into the streets, because the only thing his psychology can do with a fortune built on corpses is try to make it not be his anymore. There is a version of Jesse's money throwing that people read as a breakdown, as the behavior of a man who has simply lost his grip, and there is truth in that. He is unwell, he is not thinking clearly, he is in the grip of a despair that has no floor. But I think reading it only as madness misses what is actually happening, because there is a terrible logic to it, the same logic that runs through his whole life. Jesse has always gotten rid of good things, because he does not believe he deserves them. He traded the beautiful box for weed. He sabotaged the recovery that was offered to him. And now he takes the largest good thing he has ever possessed, a life-changing amount of money, and he throws it into the gutter. And it is the same gesture writ enormous, the same conviction that anything valuable that comes into his hands is not really his, is stolen, is stained, must be given away or destroyed before someone comes to take it and confirm, once again, that he was never allowed to keep it. The money throwing is not a departure from Jesse's psychology. It is the clearest expression of it he ever gives. And it points to the thing that separates Jesse from everyone else in the drug world, the thing that has been true since the acid ate through his bathtub floor, which is that Jesse never actually wanted any of this. He did not want money, not really, not the way Walt wanted it, not as a measure of his own significance. He fell into the trade looking for something else, for belonging, for a father who was proud of him, for a way to be somebody, and the money was always beside the point, and once it is soaked in enough blood it becomes not just beside the point, but actively poisonous to him. Walt built an empire because the empire was the goal. Jesse never had a goal, only a wound, and no amount of money fills a wound, it just sits on top of it, heavy and useless and reeking of everyone who died to produce it. Watching him scatter it across the sleeping city, you understand that Jesse would trade every dollar of it, gladly, for a single night of sleep without the door, and the boy on the bike, and Jane on her back, and that no bank on earth sells that. The truth about Brock reaches Jesse almost by accident, a small physical detail that suddenly rearranges everything he thought he knew, and the moment it lands you can watch years of denial collapse in a single face. He realizes, in a flash of horrible understanding, how the poisoning was actually done, and who must have done it, and that the whole story he was fed, the story that sent him into a war believing Gus was the poisoner, was a lie built by the one man he trusted more than any other. In an instant, Jesse understands that Walt poisoned a child he loved in order to steer him, that the man he treated as a father looked at Jesse's love for a little boy and saw a lever, and the understanding does not arrive as sadness, not at first. It arrives as fury, a white, total rage, the rage of a person who has finally seen the shape of the cage he has been living in, and realizes it was built by the hands he trusted to protect him. What is happening to Jesse in this stretch is psychologically enormous, because it is the breaking of the trauma bond, and the breaking of a trauma bond is not a gentle process, it is a kind of violence turned inward and then outward. For years Jesse's stability, such as it was, depended on believing that Walt, underneath everything, cared about him. That belief was load-bearing. It held up his entire sense of who he was in relation to the one person who mattered. And when it comes down, it does not come down alone. It takes with it his whole understanding of the last 2 years of his life, forces a total reinterpretation in which every kindness Walt ever showed him now reads as manipulation, every rescue as a move in a longer game, every warm word as bait. This is the vertigo of finally seeing an abuser clearly, the sickening rush of realizing that the story you told yourself to survive was the story your abuser wrote for you, and Jesse goes through it all at once, and it very nearly destroys him, and it also, for the first time, sets him free. He does something with the rage that marks how far he has come, and how far he still has to go. He does not simply run. He decides to hurt Walt where Walt is weakest, and then, in a sharper turn, he decides to bring Walt down through the law, allying himself with Hank Schrader, the DEA agent who once beat him bloody, now the only person as motivated as Jesse to end Walter White. It is a remarkable alliance. Two men who despise each other joined by a shared clarity about what Walt is, and for Jesse, it represents something like the first genuinely self-directed decision he has made in the entire series. For once he is not being steered, not by Walt, not by his own guilt, not by the numbing pull of the drugs. He is choosing, with his eyes open, to stop the man who has been destroying him, and everyone near him, even knowing what it will cost, even knowing it means turning on the person he loved. That clarity is hard-won, and it is real, and it is the closest Jesse comes, in the series proper, to agency. But here is the tragedy folded into the triumph, and it is the tragedy that runs under all of Jesse's growth. Every time Jesse reaches for autonomy, the world punishes him for it, and this time the punishment will be the worst of his life. The plan he and Hank build to trap Walt out in the desert works, right up until it catastrophically doesn't, until Walt, cornered, makes a phone call that summons a far greater violence than anyone anticipated, and the trap becomes a massacre. Jesse's one clear act of self-liberation leads directly into the darkest passage of his entire existence, and there is a cruelty almost too neat to bear in that structure, the way the story arranges for Jesse's healthiest choice to detonate his life. It is as if the universe of Breaking Bad has decided that Jesse is not allowed to save himself, that every door he opens toward freedom turns out to open onto a deeper pit, and the pit that this particular door opens onto is nearly literal. Before we go there, it is worth pausing on what Jesse has become by this point, psychologically, because it is easy to lose in the plot machinery. He has moved from a man who could not see Walt at all, who mistook his abuser for his savior, to a man who sees Walt completely, and that movement, in the language of trauma recovery, is the whole ballgame. It is the thing survivors spend years in therapy trying to reach, the ability to look at the person who harmed them and see them without the fog of the bond, without the reflexive excuses, without the desperate need to believe it was love. Jesse gets there. He pays a price for getting there that no one should have to pay, but he gets there, and it matters, because everything he does afterward, everything he survives afterward, is done by a man who finally knows what was done to him. He is not innocent anymore, in the sense of being naive. He has been robbed of that innocence by the truth, but he is, for the first time, awake, and an awake Jesse, even a broken one, is a different creature than the sleepwalking boy Walt recruited, and the final act of his story belongs to that awakened man. Ozymandias is widely considered the finest episode Breaking Bad ever made, and much of what makes it unbearable belongs to Jesse, though he spends most of it silent, because it is the episode where everything he feared about himself and about Walt is confirmed in the space of a single afternoon in the desert. The trap has collapsed. Hank, whom Jesse had allied with, is executed by Jack Welker's white supremacist gang, shot dead in the sand despite Walt's desperate pleading, and Walt, in his grief and his fury, turns and gives Jesse up. He had been hiding, Jesse, crawled underneath a car to escape the gunfire, and Walt spots him and points him out to the gang, hands him over to be killed, and in that moment the last thread of whatever Jesse thought their bond had been is severed by Walt's own hand. The father figure has just ordered the death of the surrogate son, coldly, as a punishment, and Jesse is dragged out from under the car into the worst hours of his life. And then, before the gang takes Jesse away, Walt does the thing that I think is the cruelest act one main character commits against another in the entire series, crueler even than the poisoning, because it has no strategic purpose at all. It is pure spite, a knife driven in for the sake of the wound. Walt looks at Jesse, this broken, terrified man who is about to be enslaved or killed, and he tells him about Jane. He tells Jesse that he was there the night Jane died, that he watched her choke, that he could have saved her and chose not to, that he let her die. There is no reason to say this except to hurt Jesse as deeply as it is possible to hurt him, to make sure that in whatever time Jesse has left he carries the knowledge that the death he blamed himself for, the death that broke him and drove him into the crack house, was Walt's doing, that Walt stood in that room and let the woman Jesse loved die, and then comforted him about it, and said nothing for years. It is a gratuitous final cruelty, the destruction of the one mercy Jesse had left, which was not knowing. Watch what Jesse does when he hears it, because it is one of the most devastating pieces of acting in the show, and it is almost entirely physical. He does not scream. He does not lunge. He goes limp. Something in him simply gives way. Some last supporting structure buckles, and you can see the exact instant the fight leaves his body, the instant a person stops being a person who is trying to survive and becomes a body that things are being done to. That limpness is the visual language of total psychological defeat, of a soul that has been asked to bear one thing too many, and has, at least for now, stopped trying to bear anything at all. Everything Jesse believed, every guilt he carried, every hope that somewhere under it all, Walt had cared, collapses in that moment into a single unbearable truth, and his body registers what his mind cannot yet process, and he goes slack in the hands of the men who are about to drag him into hell. It is the sound of a person breaking, rendered without a sound. The psychology of that limpness is worth sitting with, because it is a recognizable trauma response, the one that comes after fight and flight have both failed, the freeze, the collapse, the shutdown of an organism that has concluded, at a level below thought, that resistance is pointless and the only thing left is to endure. Animals do it in the jaws of a predator. People do it in the grip of overwhelming, inescapable harm. And Jesse, who has spent 5 seasons fighting, running, raging, numbing, trying by every means available to him to hold some piece of himself together, arrives in the desert at the end of all those strategies, with nothing left to try, and his nervous system does the last thing it can do, which is to shut the lights off and wait for it to be over. He has been broken before, many times, but this is different. This is the breaking that does not leave room even for grief, the kind that comes when the last thing you were holding on to is revealed to have been a lie the whole time. And here is what I find almost impossible to accept about Walt's confession, the detail that makes it definitive. Walt did not need to tell him. Jesse was already caught, already doomed, already given up. There was no advantage in it, no angle, no play. Walt told Jesse about Jane purely to hurt him, in the last moment he would ever have the chance to, and that tells you the final truth about what was underneath the mentorship and the father language and the shared crises all along. When the mask came all the way off, what was under it was a man who wanted to watch Jesse suffer, who could not let his surrogate son go to his fate without first making sure the boy understood that the one comfort he had left, the not knowing about Jane, was being taken from him too. It is the whole relationship distilled to its essence. Walt used Jesse when Jesse was useful, and when Jesse was no longer useful, Walt hurt him for the pleasure of it. Everything warm that ever passed between them is retroactively poisoned by that final choice, and Jesse, going limp in the sand, understands it completely, which is perhaps the worst part, that he understands. What comes after Ozymandias is a stretch of the story so bleak that some viewers find it honestly hard to watch, and I understand that, but I want to hold the frame here for a moment before we descend into it, because it matters to see clearly where Jesse is as it begins. He has lost everything. He has lost Jane twice, once to death and once to the truth. He has lost Mike, and the recovery group, and any illusion about Walt. He has lost the money, thrown it away, and Hank watched him die, and his own last belief that he might get free. He goes into captivity carrying the full and final weight of every loss at once, and no reserves left to carry it with. And the fact that there is any Jesse left at all on the other side of what comes next is, when you think about it, its own kind of miracle, though it will not feel like one while it is happening. The captivity is the part of Jesse's story that the show handles most soberly, and it is where the language of psychology stops being a lens over the character and becomes simply a description of a human being subjected to systematic dehumanization. After Ozymandias, Jesse is not killed. In some ways, what happens to him is worse. He is taken to the compound of Jack Welker's gang and kept prisoner there, held in an underground pit, a hole in the concrete covered by a grate, hauled up when they need him and lowered back down when they do not, and forced, under the constant threat of death, to cook the blue meth whose recipe is the only thing keeping him alive. His handler is Todd, the same polite young man who shot the boy off the dirt bike, and the arrangement is nothing short of slavery, a human being reduced to a tool, kept in a cage, worked for his one useful skill, and punished, controlled, and terrorized to keep him producing. This is the state Jesse lives in for what the story treats as months, though the exact span is left deliberately vague, and every day of it is designed to grind the last of the person out of him and leave only the function. What captivity does to a psyche is well documented, and Breaking Bad renders it with a restraint that makes it harder to watch rather than easier. Prolonged captivity, especially captivity that combines physical confinement with the total control of another person over whether you live or die, produces a specific constellation of damage: the erosion of the sense of self, the collapse of any belief that your actions can affect your fate, the strange and terrible attachments that can form toward captors when they are the only source of anything, even cruelty. Jesse, chained in that lab, is being systematically taught that he is not a person, that he has no will that matters, that he exists only to produce, and the version of Jesse we see during this period is a ghost, hollowed and flat and far away, a man who has retreated so deep inside himself that only a shell is left tending the equipment. The 1,000-yard stare, the flinch, the deadness behind the eyes, this is what a person looks like after the machinery of control has been running on them long enough. And yet, even here, at the absolute bottom, the thing that has always defined Jesse does not fully die, and the show is careful to show you that it is still there, buried but alive. He tries to escape. Broken as he is, hollowed as he is, some ember of the will to be free still flickers, and he makes an attempt to get out of the pit and off the compound, and it is this attempt that his captors punish in the cruelest way available to them, Which brings us to the thing they do to keep him compliant, and which I will get to in a moment. But hold on to the escape attempt itself, because it matters, because it tells you that even after Ozymandias, even after the confession about Jane, even after months in a hole, Jesse Pinkman was still, somewhere in there, a person who wanted to live free, and that ember is the whole reason there is a story left to tell. They could break his body and cage it and work it, but they could not quite reach the last small thing that still wanted out, and that failure of theirs is, in the end, what saves him. There is a detail from this period that stays with me more than almost anything else in Jesse's arc, and it is small and easy to miss. In the lab where he is forced to cook, Jesse keeps, hidden, a photograph, a picture of Andrea and Brock, the family he almost had, and he looks at it, this image of the people he loves, the life that might have been, and it is the thing he holds on to in the dark. That photograph is the pit's opposite, the proof that even reduced to a slave in a hole, Jesse is still oriented toward love, toward the people he wants to protect, toward a future with a woman and a child in it. His captors have taken everything from him, his freedom, his body, his sense of self, but they cannot take the direction his heart points, and it points, as it always has, toward a family, toward the chance to care for someone, toward the good father he has never been allowed to become. And that orientation, that stubborn persistence of love, in a man who has been given every reason to feel nothing, is the last and best evidence of what Jesse fundamentally is, and it is exactly what his captors, understanding it perfectly, will reach for when they want to destroy him completely. The punishment for Jesse's escape attempt is the darkest thing done to him in the entire series, and it is done precisely because his captors understand what the photograph means. To make sure Jesse never tries to run again, Todd takes him, restrained, unable to move or intervene, to Andrea's house, and there, on her own front porch, in front of the bound and helpless man who loves her, Todd shoots and kills Andrea. It is not done in rage. That is the horror of it. It is done calmly, as a lesson, as a demonstration to Jesse of the cost of disobedience. Todd even speaking to Jesse gently afterward, telling him it is nothing personal, that this is just the consequence of what Jesse tried to do. And Jesse, held back, screaming, forced to watch the murder of the woman he loved as a direct punishment for daring to want his freedom, absorbs a blow so precisely aimed at the center of him that it is hard to imagine a crueler one. They found the thing he loved most, and they destroyed it in front of him, and they told him it was his fault for trying to be free. The psychological logic of that murder is the logic of the entire Captivity, refined to a point. Jesse's captors have learned, as Walt learned before them, that the way to control Jesse is not through his fears, but through his loves, that the leash that holds him is the people he wants to protect. So they take one of those people and they kill her in front of him, and in doing so they convert his love itself into a mechanism of his imprisonment, because now Jesse knows, with total certainty, that if he acts, if he resists, if he tries again to escape, the next person to die will be Brock, the little boy, the last piece of the family he had. They have weaponized his tenderness so completely that his own capacity for love becomes the bars of his cage. This is the same move Walt made with the poisoning, the same move the world has been making on Jesse his entire life, reaching past his defenses to the soft, good center and using it to control him, and here it reaches its most monstrous form, a woman murdered on her porch to make a slave stay in his hole. And notice, because it is central to who Jesse is, that Brock survives. The boy is not killed. He is orphaned, his mother gone, left alone in the world, but he is alive, and that survival matters enormously to the shape of Jesse's story, because Brock alive is a thread of obligation and love that will pull Jesse forward through everything that remains. Even in the depths of the pit, even after Andrea, Jesse now carries the knowledge that there is a child out there who has lost everyone, a child Jesse loves, a child who is alive, and that knowledge is both a fresh agony and a reason to endure, because a man who has someone left to protect is a man who still has a reason to survive the unsurvivable. The captors meant Andrea's death purely as a chain. They could not have known, or perhaps did not care, that in leaving Brock alive they also left Jesse a North Star, a reason that would outlast his captivity, a debt of love that he would carry out of the pit and into whatever life he could still build. What Andrea's murder does to any remaining part of Jesse that might have wanted revenge for its own sake, that might have been tempted by the drug world's logic of power and retaliation, is clarifying. Jesse does not, in the end, become a man driven by vengeance. Even after all of this, even with every reason to want nothing but to make his tormentors suffer, what moves Jesse is not the desire to inflict pain, but the desire to be free and to protect the boy who is left. And that distinction, between a man who wants revenge and a man who wants freedom and to keep a child safe, is the final line the show draws between Jesse and the world that made him. They could turn his love into a chain. They could not turn him into one of them. Andrea's death is the last and heaviest weight they lay on him, and he carries it, as he has carried all the others, not by becoming hard, but by staying, somehow, underneath all the damage, soft in the one place that counts. The finale is called Felina, and it is Walt's episode. Walt's long, cold return to settle his accounts. But the moment it has been building toward for 5 seasons, the moment that gives the whole series its moral resolution, belongs to Jesse, and it is a moment defined by what he refuses to do. Walt comes back to the compound where Jesse is held, having rigged his car with a remote-triggered machine gun, and he sets it off, and it cuts down Jack Welker's gang in a spray of gunfire, and in the chaos Walt is mortally wounded by his own device, struck by a stray round from the very trap he built. When the shooting stops, Jesse is there, still cuffed, still a prisoner, and Todd is still alive, and what Jesse does next is the first fully free action he takes in the entire series. He goes for Todd, and using the chain of the handcuffs that had bound him, the very instrument of his captivity, he strangles the man who murdered Andrea and gunned down Drew Sharp, and he kills him with the tool of his own enslavement, which is as close to a clean piece of justice as this show ever allows. And then there is Walt, wounded, on the ground, and Walt slides a gun across the floor to Jesse, and Walt tells him to do it, to shoot him, to end it, and here is the moment. Jesse picks up the gun. He points it at the man who recruited him, used him, poisoned a child he loved, let Jane die, gave him up to be enslaved, and told him about Jane's death purely to wound him. Every reason to pull the trigger is present. The show has arranged the scene so that no one, in the audience or in the room, would blame him for it. And Jesse lowers the gun, and he says no, he will not. And when Walt, in effect, admits that he wants Jesse to do it, that dying by Jesse's hand is the ending Walt has chosen for himself, Jesse tells him to do it himself, and he drops the gun, and he walks away. He refuses to become Walt's executioner, and in refusing, he denies Walt the death Walt wanted, and takes back, in the last possible moment, the one thing that was still his to give or withhold, which is his own hand, his own will, his own refusal to let Walter White script the final act of Jesse's life, the way he scripted everything else. The psychology of that refusal is the psychology of Jesse's entire liberation, compressed into a single choice, and it is worth being precise about what it means, because it is easy to read it as mercy, and it is something more complicated and more important than mercy. Jesse does not spare Walt because he forgives him. There is no forgiveness in his face, only exhaustion and disgust, and a desperate need to be gone. Jesse refuses to kill Walt, because killing Walt is what Walt wants, and because doing it would make Jesse, in the final accounting, an instrument of Walt's will one more time, would let Walt reach out from his own death and use Jesse as the tool of his ending, exactly as he used him for everything else. To refuse is to break the pattern completely, to say, with the last of his strength, that he will not do what Walt wants ever again, not even this, not even the thing that would feel like vengeance, because Jesse understands, at some level below words, that even his revenge would belong to Walt if he took it. So he leaves Walt to die alone, on the floor of the lab, by his own hand and his own machine, and there is no cleaner rejection of a man than to deny him even the ending he begged for. And then Jesse drives out, and this is the image the whole series has been withholding, the image of Jesse Pinkman free. He gets into a car, the El Camino that belonged to Todd, and he smashes through the gate of the compound and out into the open night. And the sound he makes as he drives is not triumph, and it is not grief. It is both at once and neither. A raw, overwhelmed release, screaming and sobbing and something like laughing all tangled together. The sound of a nervous system that has been clenched for years finally letting go all at once. It is not a happy sound. It is too much for happiness. It is the sound of a man who has survived the unsurvivable and cannot yet believe it, whose body is discharging years of terror and grief in one uncontainable wave as the gate falls behind him and the road opens up ahead. He does not know where he is going. He is not healed, not free of the damage, not clean of the past. But he is out. For the first time since a man in his underwear climbed out a window in the first episode, Jesse is going somewhere no one is sending him, and the darkness he drives into is, for once, his own. That drive is where the series leaves him, and for a long time it was where his story ended. An open door, a man screaming into the night, his fate unknown, and honestly, if that had been all we ever got, it would have been enough, because the meaning was complete. Jesse survived. Jesse refused. Jesse kept, against everything, the soul the whole world had been trying to take from him. But the story was not quite finished, because the people who made it understood that leaving Jesse screaming into the dark was powerful and also, in a way, cruel, that a character who had endured this much deserved to have his morning after actually shown, and so, years later, they came back to find out what happened when the screaming stopped and the sun came up and Jesse Pinkman had to figure out how to be a free man in a world that still wanted him dead. El Camino, the film Vince Gilligan made 6 years after the series ended, picks up in the very same night, the tires still warm from that drive, and its great achievement is that it is not an action movie about a man on the run, so much as a portrait of a man carrying trauma, rendered with a patience and a clinical honesty that the propulsion of the series never had room for. The Jesse of El Camino is jumpy, paranoid, exhausted, flinching at sounds, scanning every room for threats, moving through the world like a man who expects at any moment to be grabbed and dragged back into a hole, because that is exactly what his nervous system now believes. He hides first with Skinny Pete and Badger, his 2 loyal friends who survive the whole series and who take him in without hesitation, and even in the safety of their care he cannot rest, cannot stop bracing, cannot quite inhabit the fact that he is free, and the film sits with that inability rather than rushing past it, and in doing so, it becomes the truest depiction of post-traumatic damage the whole franchise ever offered. The boldest device in the film is its use of flashback, because El Camino keeps cutting back to Jesse's time in captivity, to moments with Todd, and the structure itself mimics the way trauma actually lives in a survivor, intrusive, uncontrolled, the past bleeding into the present without warning. Jesse cannot simply move forward, because the past keeps reaching up and pulling him back, and one flashback in particular is devastating in a quiet, awful way. A memory of Todd forcing Jesse to help him dispose of a body, the body of Todd's cleaning lady, whom Todd had killed, and treating Jesse throughout with a chillingly casual friendliness, chatting, sharing a meal, as if the two of them were buddies running an errand rather than a captor and his slave burying a woman Todd murdered. That flashback tells you everything about the psychological texture of Jesse's captivity, the way the horror was wrapped in a grotesque pretense of normalcy, the way Todd's very gentleness was part of the torture, because you cannot even hate a monster cleanly when the monster is being nice to you, and Jesse had to survive months inside that impossible, mind-warping intimacy. The plot of El Camino is, on its surface, a chase for money, Jesse needing cash to buy his way to a new life, and going to Todd's apartment to find the fortune Todd had hidden there, and getting caught up with 2 men, Neil and Casey, who turn out to be the very welders who built the cage Jesse was kept in, men who profited from his imprisonment, and now stand between him and his freedom. But underneath the plot, the film is about something quieter, about whether a person this damaged can summon the will to want a future at all, and Jesse, for much of the film, seems barely able to. He is running on fumes, on instinct, on the thin thread of survival, and it is genuinely uncertain whether he has enough left in him to fight for a life rather than simply to keep from dying. The film makes you feel how heavy it is for him just to keep moving, how much the trauma weighs, how tempting the alternative of simply giving up must be for a man who has already lost this much. And then, in the confrontation with Neil, the film gives Jesse a moment that recasts everything, because when Neil offers him a way out that involves submission, involves once again bowing to a man who profited from his cage, Jesse instead proposes a quick-draw gunfight, a straight duel, and he wins it. He kills Neil, faster on the draw, and recovers the money, and the reason the scene matters is not the violence, it is what the choice reveals, that somewhere under the damage, Jesse has decided he will not spend another second of his life on his knees to men like this, that he would rather risk death standing than accept safety kneeling. It is the same refusal he gave Walt in the lab, translated into a different key, the refusal to be controlled, the refusal to let another predator dictate the terms of his existence. Jesse has learned, the hardest way anyone can learn it, that he would rather die free than live owned, and El Camino lets him prove it, lets him win, lets the man who spent months in a pit walk out of that welding shop with the money and his life, and, crucially, with something that looks almost like the return of a will to live. What I find moving about El Camino, and what I think justifies its existence beyond mere fan service, is that it treats Jesse's recovery as work, as something effortful and uncertain and hard, rather than as a switch that flips. He does not wake up healed because the series is over. He drags himself, wounded and terrified, through one more gauntlet, and every step of it costs him, and the film never pretends otherwise. And that honesty about the difficulty is itself a kind of respect, because it takes seriously what has been done to him, refuses to wave it away with a montage, insists that a man this broken has to fight for even the possibility of a future. By the time the film reaches its ending, Jesse has not been cured of anything. He is still carrying all of it, but he has done the one thing that Captivity and Walt and the whole crushing machine of his life tried to make impossible, which is to still want to live, and to be willing to fight for it, and in a story this dark, that stubborn, battered wanting is as close to hope as anyone gets. The way Jesse finally gets free is through a man the series had introduced earlier, a quiet operator who ran a vacuum repair shop as a front and, for an enormous fee, made people disappear, gave them new names and new lives in new places, far from everyone who was hunting them. Ed, the disappearer. And there is something fitting about the fact that Jesse's escape is a transaction, that freedom for a man like Jesse is not granted but bought, at great cost, with the very money that had haunted him, because it means the money finally does the one useful thing it can do. It purchases his exit. Ed relocates Jesse to Alaska, about as far from Albuquerque as a person can get and still be in the country, a cold, empty, enormous place where no one knows his name, and he goes under a new identity, Mr. Driscoll, and the film ends with Jesse driving through a vast white landscape toward a life that has not happened yet, a life that is nothing but possibility, which for this character is the boldest gift the story could give him. Alaska is not an arbitrary choice, though the person who first pointed Jesse toward it was not Jane but Mike. In one of the film's flashbacks, set back when Mike was still alive and trying to steer Jesse toward a clean exit, Mike tells him that if he were young again, he would go to Alaska, the last frontier, the one place far enough away that a man could be anything he wanted, and the idea lodges in Jesse and never leaves. What Jane gives him is something different, and in its way deeper. The film returns, near the very end, to a memory of the two of them together, back when there was still a future to imagine, and in it Jesse repeats back to her a philosophy he thought was hers, the idea that you should let the universe carry you where it will, and Jane corrects him. She tells him she never really believed that it is better to make your own decisions, to choose your own direction, rather than wait to be moved. And the whole ending of the film is Jesse, at last, doing exactly that, taking his life into his own hands and pointing it north on purpose, enacting the counsel of one lost friend toward a destination named by another, which is the exact thing his psychology could never do before. Before he goes, Jesse does one more thing, and it is the thing that tells you his soul survived intact, that the Captivity and Walt and all of it did not finally take from him the one quality that always defined him. He writes a letter to Brock. He cannot see the boy, cannot be part of his life, cannot risk it, but he writes to him a goodbye, a message to the orphaned child of the woman he loved, and in that gesture is the whole of Jesse Pinkman. Even at the moment of his own escape, even as he disappears into a new identity and a new life, his thoughts turn to a child who has lost everyone, to the impulse to comfort, to protect, to let the boy know he was loved and not forgotten. The very last thing Jesse does before he vanishes is an act of care aimed at a child, which is exactly where his soul has lived since the neglected boy in that filthy house years before, and the symmetry is not an accident. It is the show telling you that this, the tenderness toward children, was always the real Jesse, and it made it out alive. Now, whether Alaska is redemption or merely escape is a question the film deliberately leaves open, and I think it is important not to resolve it too neatly, because Jesse's ending is not a cure, and the story is careful never to pretend it is. He is not healed. A man does not walk out of years like Jesse's into wholeness. He is going to carry the trauma into Alaska, the flashbacks, the hypervigilance, the grief, the faces of the dead, and no amount of snow and distance will erase what was done to him and what he did. What Alaska offers is not the end of suffering, but the end of the machine, The removal, at last, of Jesse from the world that kept grinding him, the chance, for the first time in his adult life, to be somewhere that is not actively trying to destroy him. Whether he can build something real there, whether he can heal, whether he can be happy, the film does not say, and its refusal to say is honest, because those things are not guaranteed to anyone, least of all to someone this damaged, and to promise them would cheapen everything that came before. But escape is not nothing. This is the thing I want to land on, because there is a temptation to be disappointed that Jesse's ending is only survival, only freedom, only a chance rather than a triumph, and I think that reading undersells what the story is actually saying. For a character who spent 5 seasons being told, by his family and by Walt and by the whole cruel machinery of his world, that he was worthless, that he deserved every bad thing, that he was the bad thing, simply to survive, to get out, to keep his soul, to be driving toward a future he chose, with a letter of love in his wake, is an enormous victory, maybe the only kind of victory available to a person who has been through what Jesse has been through. He does not get to be happy on screen, he gets to be free, and to still be himself, and to still be capable of love, and after everything, that is so much more than the world ever meant to let him keep. There is a side of Jesse we have circled, but not looked at directly, and it is his capacity for rage, because it would be a mistake to leave you with the impression that he is only soft, only a victim, only a wounded soul absorbing blows. Jesse can be violent, and dangerous, and his violence is one of the more revealing things about his psychology, once you notice the pattern in it, which is that his rage almost never fires in defense of himself, and almost always fires in defense of someone weaker, and specifically, again and again, in defense of children. Trace his eruptions across the series and they cluster around the harming of the vulnerable, and that pattern is not incidental, it is the key to the whole man, because it tells you that even his anger is organized around the same intact moral core as his tenderness, that the same conscience that cannot forgive itself for Gale is what turns murderous when a child is used or discarded. The clearest example comes in the 3rd season, in an episode called Half Measures, and it is worth telling because it shows Jesse's protective rage at full and terrible force. There are 2 dealers, working for the larger organization, who had been using a young boy to do their killing, the same boy, Tomas, who had shot Jesse's friend Combo, a child pressed into murder by grown men who should have been protecting him. And when those men, to tie off a loose end, kill the boy himself, Jesse comes apart, and he does not respond with grief the way he responds to most deaths. He responds with a cold, suicidal fury. He arms himself and goes to confront the 2 dealers directly, prepared to kill them and almost certainly to die doing it. A lone, half-broken man walking up to hardened killers because a child was used and thrown away, and someone has to answer for it. It is Walt who intervenes, who screeches up in his car and runs the 2 men down and then tells Jesse to run, and the rescue is real, but the thing to hold on to is what drove Jesse to that street in the first place, which was not self-interest and not even simple revenge, but the unbearable wrongness of grown men murdering a child, a wrongness Jesse could not let stand even at the cost of his own life. This is what I mean when I say Jesse's rage is the flip side of his tenderness rather than its opposite. The same nervous system that puts on a puppet show for a neglected boy is the one that arms itself over the murder of a child dealer, and both are expressions of a single, coherent moral fact about him, that harm done to the defenseless is the one thing he cannot tolerate, in himself or in anyone else. His anger, in other words, is moral anger, righteous in the old sense of the word, and it stands in stark contrast to the anger of nearly everyone else in his world, whose violence serves ego, or profit, or fear, or the cold logic of the trade. Walt kills to protect his empire and his pride. Jack's gang kills for money and dominance. Todd kills without any feeling at all. Jesse, when Jesse turns violent, is almost always trying to protect someone who cannot protect themselves, and even when that impulse leads him into darkness, into the strangling of Todd or the confrontation in the street, it comes from the part of him that never stopped believing the vulnerable deserve a defender. There are, in a sense, 2 Jesses, and the whole tragedy of the character is that the world keeps forcing the wrong one into being. There is the Jesse who could have been a caretaker, a teacher, a father, the gentle and creative man who made the beautiful box and tended the frightened boy, and there is the Jesse the drug world hammered into existence, the one who can kill, who has killed, who has been driven to violence again and again. And what makes his story a tragedy, rather than a simple fall, is that both Jesses come from the same root, the same deep well of care, so that even the violent Jesse is, at bottom, the loving one, twisted into a shape the world found more use for. He was never a bad man forced to act good. He was a good man forced, over and over, to act in ways that violated his own nature, and the violence he was pushed into is not evidence against his goodness. It is the scar tissue his goodness grew over the wounds the world kept inflicting. And this is why, I think, audiences forgive Jesse things they would never forgive in another character. Why we watch him kill Gale and strangle Todd and confront those dealers and never once stop rooting for him, never once file him with the villains. It is because we can feel, underneath every violent act, the moral engine that drives it, the fact that his worst deeds are done in anguish, and his cruelest impulses are aimed at people who have harmed the innocent. Jesse is the rarest thing in a story like this, a person whose violence deepens our sympathy rather than eroding it, because his violence is always a symptom of his conscience rather than a betrayal of it, and by the end, when he strangles the man who murdered Andrea and shot a child off a dirt bike, it does not feel like Jesse falling, it feels like justice finally finding a hand willing to deliver it, and that we can feel the difference is the whole achievement of the character. Something I do not think gets said often enough about Jesse is that he is, across the whole series, a person in an almost permanent state of grief, and that his grief is of a particular kind, the kind that never gets the room it needs to finish. Grief, when it can run its natural course, is supposed to move, slowly and painfully, towards some kind of integration, a place where the loss still hurts but no longer defines every waking moment, where the dead can be carried rather than actively bled for. Jesse never gets that room. The losses come too fast and too close together, each one landing before the last has begun to settle, so that his grief never completes a single cycle before the next catastrophe forces it back to the beginning. Combo, then Jane, then Gale, then the boy on the bike, then Andrea, a procession of the dead that never pauses long enough for him to properly mourn any one of them, and the result is a grief that pools and stagnates instead of flowing, that accumulates into something heavier and more toxic than ordinary mourning. Clinicians have a name for grief that gets stuck like this: complicated grief, mourning that does not resolve, that stays raw and consuming, long past the point where healing should have begun. And Jesse is a portrait of it, though of course the reason his grief cannot resolve is not some failure in him, it is that his circumstances never once allow it. You cannot mourn Jane when you are being beaten by a DEA agent and pulled back into the trade. You cannot mourn Gale when you are being handed a gun and told to keep cooking. You cannot mourn Andrea when you are chained in a pit being forced to work. Grief needs safety to do its work, needs a stretch of time where you are not under threat, where the nervous system can come down enough to actually feel the loss rather than just survive it, and Jesse is almost never safe, and so his grief has nowhere to go, and it turns inward, and it fuses with the guilt and the trauma into a single undifferentiated weight that he drags through every episode. And there is a specific cruelty in the way Jesse's griefs are so often tangled up with his guilt, because it means he cannot even mourn cleanly, cannot simply miss the people he lost, because his mind insists on holding him responsible for their deaths. He does not just grieve Jane, he blames himself for Jane, and for a long time he does so on the basis of a lie Walt told him by omission. He does not just grieve Combo, he blames himself for putting him on the corner. He does not just grieve Andrea, he knows she died as a punishment for his own attempt to be free. Every loss comes with a self-accusation stapled to it, so that grief and guilt become inseparable, and mourning, which is hard enough on its own, becomes for Jesse a form of self-torture, each memory of the beloved dead also an indictment of the man who loved them. This is grief weaponized against the griever, and it is one more way the machinery of Jesse's psychology turns his own goodness, his own capacity for love and loss, into an instrument of his suffering. You can see the toll of all this unmourned grief in the way Jesse changes physically across the series, and it is one of the things the performance captures that no amount of dialogue could, the way he seems to age a decade in 2 years, the way the brightness goes out of him, the way the boy who bounced around cooking in the desert becomes the hollow, gray, exhausted man of the final season and the film. That is what carrying this much unresolved loss does to a person. It wears them down at a level below the emotional. It shows up in the body, in the eyes, in the posture, in the sheer heaviness of simply moving through a day. Jesse is being crushed, slowly, by the accumulated weight of everyone he could not save and everyone he could not properly mourn, and by the end he is a young man who moves like someone very old, because grief that cannot complete itself does not stay in the heart. It settles into the whole organism and becomes the medium the person lives in. And this, I think, is part of why the ending in Alaska matters so much, and why it would be wrong to dismiss it as a small or insufficient reward. What Alaska finally offers Jesse, more than freedom or safety in the abstract, is the one thing his grief has never had, which is room. Space, time, a place where no new catastrophe is scheduled to arrive, where the nervous system might, over months and years, come down far enough to finally feel and integrate the enormous backlog of loss he has been carrying unprocessed for so long. The film cannot show us that healing, because it takes far longer than a film, but it can put Jesse somewhere that healing becomes possible for the first time, and that is not nothing. That is, for a man whose grief has been trapped and stagnant for years, very close to everything. Alaska is not where Jesse's pain ends. It is where, at last, it is allowed to begin moving toward its end. And after everything, the mere possibility of that motion is a kind of mercy the story spent 5 seasons refusing him. Step back far enough from the individual traumas, and you can see the structural role Jesse plays in Breaking Bad as a whole, and it is a role that a lot of people sense without quite naming, which is that Jesse is the conscience of the show, the moral center against which everything else is measured, the character whose reactions tell you how you are supposed to feel about what you are watching. Walt is the engine of the plot, the one whose choices drive the story, but Walt is an unreliable moral guide precisely because he is always lying to himself, always constructing the story in which he is justified. Jesse is the one who cannot lie to himself about the cost, and so his face, his breakdown, his refusal to be soothed, becomes the series' way of keeping you honest about what is really happening. When something monstrous occurs, the camera cuts to Jesse, and Jesse's devastation is the truth the scene is telling, underneath whatever rationalization Walt is spinning, and in that sense Jesse is not just a character in the story, he is the story's moral instrument, the needle that always points at the real weight of things. This is why the series is engineered, across its run, to migrate your sympathy, and it is one of the great deliberate long-form manipulations in television, and it runs directly through Jesse. In the beginning, Walt is the protagonist you root for, the sympathetic everyman with cancer, and Jesse is the screw-up, the comic relief, the liability. And then, degree by degree, season by season, the show inverts it, revealing Walt's darkness and Jesse's depth, until by the end the audience that once rolled its eyes at Jesse is desperate for him to survive, and repulsed by the man they used to cheer. That migration is the series' central moral argument made flesh, the demonstration that the charming, competent, self-justifying man was the monster all along, and the stumbling, guilt-ridden screw-up was the one with the soul. And it works because Jesse earns it, because every season gives you more evidence that the person breaking under the weight of the harm is a truer human being than the person who has learned to carry it lightly. The show trains you, slowly, to value the right things, and Jesse is the classroom. The contrast between Jesse and Walt is, in the end, a contrast between 2 ways of responding to having done wrong, and it is the deepest thing the show has to say about morality. Walt does terrible things and metabolizes them, folds each one into a narrative of necessity and family and pride, and emerges from every atrocity with his self-image intact, and that capacity, which looks like strength, is revealed to be the very mechanism of his damnation, because a man who can always justify himself is a man who can do anything. Jesse does far fewer terrible things and cannot metabolize any of them, is visibly poisoned by each, cannot construct the story where he is fine, and that incapacity, which looks like weakness, is revealed to be the mark of a conscience that refused to die. The show's verdict is unambiguous once you see it, that the ability to live comfortably with your own harm is the real corruption, and that the inability to do so, the guilt, the breakdown, the refusal to accept yourself, is, however much it costs, the sign that you are still morally alive. Jesse suffers more than Walt because Jesse is better than Walt, and the suffering is the proof. And there is a quiet, aching poignancy in the fact that Jesse never knows this about himself, that Breaking Bad tells the audience he is the soul of the story, but Jesse himself goes not to his grave, but to his freedom, still convinced he is the ruin at the center of things, the screw-up, the person who wrecks what he touches. The verdict the series reaches about Jesse, that he is its moral center, its most human figure, the one whose conscience redeems the whole grim enterprise, is a verdict Jesse would never accept about himself, because the self-hatred installed in childhood and reinforced by Walt never fully lifts, He cannot see what we see. He carries himself as the failure his family named him, even as he becomes, in front of us, the closest thing this world of monsters has to a good man. That gap, between how the show frames him and how he frames himself, is one of the quiet heartbreaks of the whole thing. The tragedy of a person who is loved by millions of viewers precisely for a goodness he is constitutionally unable to believe he possesses. What Jesse offers the audience, ultimately, is a way to hold on to their own moral bearings inside a story designed to seduce them into rooting for a monster, and that is a genuinely important thing for a work of fiction to do. Breaking Bad is, on one level, a show that makes you complicit, that gets you cheering for a man's descent into evil by dressing it up as empowerment, and a story that only did that would be a kind of poison. But the show includes its own antidote, and the antidote is Jesse, the character who keeps feeling the things the audience is being tempted to stop feeling, who keeps insisting, with his whole broken body, that the harm is real, and the dead are real, and none of this is okay. As long as Jesse is on screen refusing to be numb, the audience cannot fully go numb either, and in that sense Jesse does for the viewer exactly what a conscience does for a person. He keeps the moral nerve alive when everything is conspiring to deaden it, and that, more than any plot function, is why the series does not work without him, and why they could not, in the end, let him die. There is a piece of behind-the-scenes history around Jesse that has become fairly well known, and it is worth telling plainly, because it changes how you see the whole character to know it. Jesse Pinkman was supposed to die. In Vince Gilligan's original conception of the show, Jesse was a relatively minor figure who would be killed off at the end of the first season, reportedly around the 9th episode, his death serving as a hard lesson for Walt about the brutality of the world he had entered. That was the plan. Jesse was, in the initial design, disposable, a device to harden the protagonist, and two things intervened to save him. The first was the writer's strike of that era, which cut the first season short, to 7 episodes, and disrupted the schedule that would have delivered Jesse's death. And the second, the decisive one, was that Gilligan and the other producers watched what happened when Aaron Paul and Bryan Cranston shared the screen, and they understood that they had something they had not planned for, a chemistry between the two actors so alive and so charged that killing one of them would be a kind of vandalism against their own show. So they kept him, and they rebuilt the series around a relationship they had not originally intended to be its center, and I find it almost staggering to reckon with what that means, because it means the entire moral architecture we have been discussing, the conscience of the show, the migration of sympathy, the surrogate father tragedy, all of it, was in a sense an accident, or rather a discovery, something the writers found rather than something they set out to make. The soul of Breaking Bad was almost thrown away in the first season, and the only reasons it survived were a labor dispute and a young actor so good that the writers could not bring themselves to waste him. There is something fitting, even, about the fact that the character whose whole story is about being underestimated and nearly discarded was himself very nearly discarded by the people who created him, and was saved because someone finally saw his worth, which is, when you think about it, the exact thing that never quite happens for Jesse inside the story, and did happen for him in the making of it. The actor deserves the credit history has given him, because the depth we have been talking about for this entire discussion does not exist on the page alone. It exists in a performance of extraordinary sensitivity, and the recognition it received was real. Aaron Paul won the Emmy for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Drama Series 3 separate times for playing Jesse, an achievement that reflects how completely he transformed what could have been a stock role, the junkie sidekick, into one of the great tragic figures of the medium. What Paul understood, and what every one of those awards acknowledges, is that Jesse's power lives in the small things, the flicker of hurt behind the bravado, the way the eyes go dead in Captivity, the physical collapse when Walt tells him about Jane, the sound of that drive into the night that is not quite a scream and not quite a sob. Those are acting choices, hundreds of them, accumulated across years, and they are the reason a character conceived as disposable became the emotional core of one of the most acclaimed television dramas ever made. There is a small detail that underlines how much the character evolved from its origins, which is that in the earliest version of the pilot script, Jesse was not even called Jesse, he went by a different name entirely, and the character as first sketched bore little resemblance to the person he became. Everything that makes Jesse Jesse, the specific texture of his damage, the tenderness, the guilt, the particular music of his speech, was developed and deepened over time, discovered in the doing, shaped by the collaboration between the writing and the performance across 5 seasons. This is often how the greatest characters come to be, not fully formed in a single vision, but grown, layer by layer, as the people making them come to understand who they are. And Jesse is a supreme example of it, a character who became more himself with every season, who kept revealing depths that were not in the original plan, because the plan was too small to contain what he turned out to be. And knowing all of this changes the weight of the ending, because when you understand that Jesse was meant to die in the first season, and instead survived all the way to a hopeful dawn in Alaska, his survival takes on a second meaning, a meaning that lives in the space between the show and its own making. The character who was supposed to be sacrificed to teach the protagonist a lesson instead outlives the protagonist, drives away from Walt's corpse into a future of his own, and gets, years later, an entire film devoted to his escape. The story chose life for the character the story originally planned to kill, and it did so because everyone involved came to love him too much to let him go, which is, in its own way, the thing Jesse spends the whole series looking for and never finding inside the fiction, someone who sees his worth and refuses to throw him away. He never gets that from his family, or from Walt, but he got it, in the end, from the people who made him, and that is why he is alive at the end of the tale, driving north, carrying the one piece of wisdom the people who loved him managed to leave him, that a person can still choose his own direction, toward a life he is finally pointing on purpose. When I try to understand why Jesse Pinkman has stayed with so many people the way he has, why he is so often the character viewers say they cared about most, I keep coming back to the fact that he is, underneath the specifics of meth and Albuquerque and the drug trade, a very recognizable kind of person. The person who is better than the story they were handed about themselves. Most people do not cook drugs in the desert, but a great many people know exactly what it is to have absorbed, young, a verdict about their own worthlessness, to carry a version of apply yourself scrawled somewhere inside them, to move through life half convinced they are the family disappointment, the screw-up, the one who ruins things. Jesse externalizes a wound that is enormously common, and then he does something with it that is quietly heroic, which is that he refuses, again and again, at tremendous cost, to become as bad as he believes himself to be. He thinks he is the bad thing, and he spends the entire series proving, to everyone except himself, that he is not. That, I think, is the deepest source of his resonance, this gap between his self-image and his actions, because it is a gap a lot of us live inside. Jesse believes he is worthless, and behaves, when it counts, with more moral courage than almost anyone around him. He believes he is stupid, and reveals, in the woodwork and the chemistry and the streetwise competence, a real and various intelligence. He believes he destroys what he loves, and turns out to be the fiercely protective, tender figure in the whole cast, the one children trust, the one who cannot walk past a suffering kid. The story he tells about himself is relentlessly negative and almost entirely wrong, and watching a person be so much better than they think they are is one of the truly moving things a story can offer, because it gives the audience permission to suspect the same might be true of themselves, that the harsh verdict they carry might also be a lie installed too early to argue with. There is also, in Jesse, a particular kind of dignity that speaks directly to anyone who has survived something they did not choose, and it is the dignity of refusing to go numb. The easy path, the path Walt takes, the path Todd was born already walking, is to stop feeling, to let the harm harden you until it cannot reach you anymore, and our culture often mistakes that hardening for strength. Jesse is the standing refutation of that mistake. He never hardens, he feels everything, all the way down, every death and every betrayal, and it nearly destroys him, and he keeps feeling anyway, and the show insists, against the whole grain of the tough guy myth, that this is the braver and better way to be. To stay tender in a world that punishes tenderness, to keep your conscience alive when numbness would be so much easier, to go on caring about the vulnerable even after caring has cost you everything, that is a form of courage our stories do not celebrate nearly enough. And Jesse is one of its great examples. A man whose refusal to stop hurting is correctly understood, his refusal to stop being human. And his ending, when you hold all of this in mind, offers something rare and valuable, which is a model of survival that is honest about its limits. Jesse does not get a triumphant recovery, does not ride into the sunset healed and whole, does not defeat his trauma. What he gets is a chance, hard-won and incomplete, to begin, somewhere far away, the long work of living with what happened to him, And there is a kind of hope in that which is more durable than the fantasy of a clean, happy ending, because it is a hope real people can actually use. It says that you can be broken this badly and still get out. It says that survival is not the same as being unhurt, that you can carry the whole weight of your history and still point your life somewhere new, that freedom is not the absence of scars, but the room to live alongside them. For anyone who has come through something dark, Jesse's Alaska is a truer comfort than any cure, because it does not lie about the cost, and it still, at the end of all that cost, chooses life. I keep thinking about the box, the one from the very beginning of all this, the beautiful thing Jesse made and traded away because he could not believe he deserved to keep it. And I think the whole arc of Jesse Pinkman, from that box to that drive north, is the story of a man slowly, agonizingly, at enormous cost, learning to keep one good thing, and the good thing he finally keeps is himself. Everything else gets taken or thrown away. The money, the people he loved, the years, the illusions about Walt, all of it stripped from him one piece at a time. But the soul, the conscience, the tenderness, the stubborn refusal to become what the world kept trying to make him, that he holds on to, all the way to the end, and drives away with it into the snow. He could not keep the box. He kept the thing the box was really about, which was the proof that he was capable of making something good, and by the end, the good thing he has made, against every conceivable odd, is a self worth saving. That is the victory. It is quiet, and it is partial, and it is his, and after everything, it is enough. There is one form of love in Jesse's life that never once betrays him, and it is easy to overlook because it comes wrapped in the same goofy, low-stakes comedy that the show uses for so much of Jesse's world, and that is the friendship of Skinny Pete and Badger. These two are, by any conventional measure, minor characters, comic relief, a pair of amiable stoners on the fringe of the story, and yet when everything else in Jesse's life has collapsed, when Jane is dead, and Andrea is dead, and Mike is dead, and Walt has been revealed as a monster, and the whole edifice of his life has come down, it is these two ridiculous, loyal men who take him in. In the film, when Jesse has nowhere to go, a fugitive with the entire world hunting him, he comes to them, and they do not hesitate, not for a second. They hide him, they feed him, they clean him up, they give him what they have, and one of them puts himself directly at risk, offering up his own vehicle and standing between Jesse and the manhunt, to buy his friend a chance to get away. I find this one of the more touching things in the whole saga, and I do not think the show gets enough credit for it, because it quietly answers a question the series spends 5 seasons raising, which is whether Jesse is capable of being loved well, whether the problem is him or the people he kept ending up with. And the answer, sitting right there in Skinny Pete and Badger, is that Jesse was always lovable, always worth showing up for, and the tragedy was never that he could not inspire loyalty, but that so much of the loyalty he inspired was in people the world had also thrown away, people without the power to save him from the forces that were crushing him. These two could not protect Jesse from Walt or Gus or Jack. They were too small, too far down, too powerless. But when it finally came down to a moment they could affect, a friend on the run needing a place to hide, they were there, completely, without conditions, and their loyalty is the proof that the regard Jesse gave so freely to his friends across the years was returned, that he had, all along, planted something real. The contrast with Walt could not be sharper, and it is worth naming, because it clarifies what love actually looked like in Jesse's life, versus what he mistook for it. Walt's care was always conditional, always a lever, always mixed with use and control, dispensed and withdrawn to keep Jesse in orbit. Skinny Pete and Badger ask for nothing. They gain nothing by helping him. Helping him is, in fact, dangerous and costly, and offers them no reward beyond the fact that Jesse is their friend, and their friend needs help, and that is what actual love looks like, unglamorous and unconditional, and willing to bear a cost for no return. Jesse spent years starving for love while chasing it from the one man least able to give it, and the whole time, on the margins of his life, in the persons of two guys he probably underestimated as much as everyone underestimated him, real love was quietly waiting, and it is the thing that helps carry him to freedom in the end. The people the world dismissed saved the man the world dismissed, and there is a rightness to that which lingers long after the film is over. There is one last thing I keep turning over, and it is the question of whether Jesse deserves the ending he gets, because the show is very careful never to answer it, and I have come to think the refusal is the point. Jesse has killed, He killed Gale, an innocent man, face to face. He sold poison to desperate people, some of whom surely died of it. He was part of an enterprise that murdered a child. By the cold arithmetic of guilt and punishment, a case can be made against him, and Jesse himself makes that case constantly, more harshly than any prosecutor ever would. And yet the series does not punish him, does not kill him, does not send him to prison, does not deliver the tidy moral accounting that a lesser story would reach for. It simply lets him go free, damaged and haunted and alive, and it declines to tell you whether he earned it. He is neither absolved nor condemned. He is just released into a future the story will not moralize about, and left to carry his own verdict on himself for as long as he lives. I think that ambiguity is the most honest thing the show could have done, because real moral life does not come with a final judgment, and people who have done wrong under unbearable pressure do not get sorted cleanly into the forgiven and the damned. Jesse is guilty, and Jesse is a victim, and Jesse is good, and Jesse is broken, all at once, and none of those truths cancels the others, and the story refuses to flatten him into any single one of them. What it gives him instead is the only thing that was ever really his to be given, which is another day, and then another, in a place where the machine that made him is finally switched off. Whether he uses those days to heal or to drown, whether he forgives himself or never does, whether Alaska becomes a home or just a colder kind of exile, the story leaves entirely open, because those questions belong to Jesse now, and for the first time in his life, the answers are his to write. Breaking Bad has been over for more than a decade now, and it is strange how much of what endures about it, when the shootouts and the schemes and the famous twists have faded a little in memory, is the face of Jesse Pinkman. People remember Walt's transformation, of course, the teacher into the monster, the great dark engine of the thing. But when I ask people what they felt, what actually stayed with them, so often it is Jesse, the puppet show for a frightened boy, the box traded away for nothing, the collapse in the desert, the scream as the gate came down. It is a curious thing about how memory works with a story like this, that the loudest character is not always the one who lasts, that the man who drove the plot can fade, while the man who felt its cost stays vivid, and I think that is because feeling is what we actually recognize in each other, what we carry home from a story and keep. We do not, in the end, remember Jesse for what he did. We remember him for how much everything cost him, for the fact that he never learned to stop paying, and that unbroken capacity to be wounded by the world is, strangely, the warmest thing in a very cold show. He was the character we were not supposed to care about, conceived to be discarded, and he became the one whose survival we needed more than we needed anything else in the story. And that reversal is the whole show in miniature, the demonstration that the person the world writes off is so often the one carrying the soul. So if you have made it this far, drifting towards sleep, let that be the thing you carry down with you, the image of a battered, decent man driving north through the snow with a letter of love behind him, and, for once, a direction he chose himself, free at last, not fixed but free, still himself after everyone tried to take that from him too. There are worse things to fall asleep to than the story of someone who was told his whole life that he was worthless, and who proved at enormous cost, over 5 long seasons and 1 quiet dawn, that he was not. He kept his soul when keeping it should have been impossible. And in a story with almost no mercy in it, that turned out to be the one mercy that mattered. Thank you for spending this time here in the dark with me and with Jesse. Rest well. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.